Picture Britain in the grip of winter. Not the cosy postcard kind with rosy cheeks, jingling bells and mulled wine, but the kind that makes brass door handles bite like angry ferrets. The Great Victorian Freeze wasn't one event. It was a recurring seasonal ambush that turned the proud, steam-driven empire into an unwilling popsicle. Every year, as the temperature dropped and the fog thickened, the industrial age collided headfirst with the ice age, and the result? Britain's shiny new modernity suddenly remembered it was built on mud, iron and optimism, not central heating. By the mid-19th century, Victorians were riding the high of technological triumph. Railways stitched the land together, bridges leapt across rivers, and Londoners could travel to Edinburgh without having to pack a will. But all of this progress had a fatal weakness: weather. The same iron that drove locomotives also froze solid. Rails cracked, engines stalled, and passengers discovered that express train was more of an aspiration than a promise. When snow blanketed the tracks, even the mighty steam locomotive looked less like a marvel of engineering and more like a very heavy, very useless kettle. Hello, travellers! Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. For the Victorians, this was a national insult. This was the age of empire. They could colonise entire continents, but a few inches of white fluff could bring Birmingham to a halt. Newspapers called it unprecedented weather. Farmers called it Thursday. But for travellers, it meant misery. Snow-choked roads, silent telegraphs, and train stations filled with people pretending they weren't cold while slowly freezing into statues of good manners. City dwellers fared no better. Streets became skating rinks for horses and humans alike. Stagecoaches slid sideways into lampposts. The Thames, on particularly bad years, froze solid. An awe-inspiring sight until you realised that the city's water supply had also just been sealed under several inches of ice and sewage. Vendors bravely set up frost fairs on the frozen river, selling roasted chestnuts and bad decisions to anyone foolish enough to stand still long enough to freeze to the cobblestones. Victorians were tough, though. They had survived worse: cholera, bad dentistry, and unventilated corsets. The cold was just another enemy to endure politely. Ladies wore layer upon layer of wool and still pretended to glow with delicate femininity rather than hypothermia. Gentlemen puffed cigars to stay warm, conveniently forgetting that matches didn't work when damp. And everyone took refuge in the comforting lie that this sort of weather built character, because if it didn't, then it was just cruel. In rural areas, isolation turned quickly into survivalism. Villages were cut off for weeks at a time, livestock perished in the fields, and the only mail you received was the snowdrift outside your door. Yet even in these conditions, travellers trudged on, by coach, by train, or failing both, by sheer stubbornness. Because Victorians didn't stop moving, they just did it colder, slower, and while loudly insisting it was invigorating. As the snow deepened, so did the nation's frustration. Businesses halted. Coal couldn't be delivered because trains were stuck, and trains were stuck because there was no coal to power them. It was a beautiful circle of suffering. And through it all, newspapers offered cheery advice like keep a brave heart, or boil water before drinking, as if either could thaw your frozen boots. This wasn't just a cold snap, it was an existential crisis. The Victorians had built a world of progress, precision and punctuality, and now the elements laughed in their faces. Clocks froze, factory machines jammed, even church bells were silenced, their ropes stiff with frost. And yet, the people endured. They gathered around coal stoves, told grimly funny stories, and drank tea thick enough to double as insulation. If there was a silver lining, it was that the snow made everything look beautiful. Even the dirtiest industrial towns looked like fairy tale villages under a white blanket, so long as you ignored the frozen water pumps and collapsing roofs. Artists painted the scenes, poets wrote about the purity of winter, and everyone else just wished the purity came with better shoes. So there it was, the Great Victorian Freeze, a time when nature reminded Britain that for all its factories, engines and ambition, it was still a small island on a cold planet. The era of steam had met its icy match, and while engineers schemed and travellers suffered, one fact remained unchanged. Progress might move mountains, but it still couldn't melt snow. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So's the frostbite. The Victorians believed that the railway would conquer everything, time to distance, boredom, and the limits of human patience. They were half right. Steam engines could flatten hills, outrun horses, and make you late for appointments in entirely new and exciting ways. But when winter arrived, all that iron confidence met its greatest nemesis, the fluffy, freezing chaos of snow. The train that had conquered distance found itself defeated by the weather that looked suspiciously like icing sugar. At first, the engineers didn't take it seriously. A little snow, they thought, will make the view picturesque. Then the picturesque snowdrift grew until it looked like a modest alpine range. Steam engines, which normally thundered across the countryside like mechanical gods, suddenly sat there wheezing in confusion, their wheels spinning helplessly. It turns out that snow is the great equalizer. It humbles everything from peasants to progress. Picture the scene. A roaring locomotive charging down the track, smoke billowing, pistons pounding, and then, thud! It hits a drift. Steam hisses, wheels lock, and the driver swears in several denominations. Passengers peer out the frost-lined windows, watching men in wool coats and questionable optimism grab shovels. It was less age of steam and more age of digging. The main problem was design. Steam engines were built for momentum, not resistance. They relied on friction between steel wheels and rails, a relationship that melted faster than good manners when snow got involved. Ice turned rails into slides. Drifts clogged the cow catchers. Ironically, they caught cows beautifully, but failed miserably at catching blizzards, and freezing temperatures made the metal contract, cracking bolts and stiffening brakes. Imagine trying to run a marathon in a frozen suit of armour. That was a Victorian locomotive in January. Railway companies, of course, tried to fight back with Victorian ingenuity. The sort of creativity born of desperation and tea. The most straightforward solution was manpower. When a train got stuck, the answer wasn't advanced machinery. It was a small army of men with shovels. They would dig for hours, clearing the tracks one frozen scoop at a time, while the passengers inside debated whether this counted as adventure or a slow, icy death. Then came the snowplough engines, great iron wedges bolted to the front of locomotives, designed to blast through snowdrifts like heroic knights of progress. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it was like attacking a mountain with enthusiasm. When it worked, crowds cheered. When it didn't, the plough buried itself, leaving another engine to rescue the rescuer. Somewhere out there, a Victorian railman probably invented the phrase, "We'll need a bigger plough." Even the mighty steam itself rebelled against the cold. Water froze in the tender, pipes burst, and boilers lost pressure. A frozen valve could turn a proud locomotive into a hissing, sulking teapot. Drivers tried every trick, stuffing rags around joints, lighting extra fires, or adding salt to the water, which worked about as well as seasoning a snowman. Engineers reported unusual noises, which in railway language meant it's about to explode. And yet, through all this chaos, the Victorians refused to surrender their schedules. Trains were delayed, cancelled, and occasionally misplaced entirely under snow, but timetables remained gospel. A frozen engine at 2:00 p.m. was still officially the 2:00 p.m. service to Manchester, stiff upper lip, stiff everything else. Newspapers chronicled the struggles with a mix of awe and indignation, as if nature's audacity to delay human invention was a personal insult. There's a story from the 1860s about a train trapped for 2 full days near Shap Summit in Cumbria. Passengers rationed their sandwiches, stoked fires into the compartments, and stared accusingly at one another for warmth. When rescue finally came, they emerged blinking into daylight like survivors of a particularly polite apocalypse. No one sued, they simply nodded. declared it quite the journey, and promptly boarded again the next week. The irony, of course, was delicious. Steam power, the marvel that connected the empire, couldn't defeat condensation. The same water that drove the engines was also its undoing, turning to ice, cracking pipes and smothering motion under snow. It was as if the technology's own essence had staged a revolt. But despite the failures, there was something magnificent about it all. The sight of iron beasts roaring defiantly into white oblivion, sparks flying, steam screaming into the frozen air. The Victorians may not have conquered winter, but they certainly dramatised it. Each blizzard became a public spectacle, each triumph a national headline, and if half the passengers lost feeling in their toes along the way, well, that was simply the price of progress. The good news, the train was still technically moving. The bad news, so was the snowdrift. Long before commuters blamed leaves on the line, Victorians were already inventing creative ways to explain why they were very cold, very late, and slowly losing faith in timetables. The golden age of rail travel promised speed, comfort, and punctuality, 3 words that winter gleefully deleted from the dictionary. When snow buried the tracks and engines sulked into silence, the result was the birth of something truly British, the noble art of the railway delay excuse. Imagine it. You've paid good money for a ticket labelled Express. You climb aboard, wrapped in optimism and questionable wool. The carriage jerks, hisses, moves, and then stops. Minutes pass, then hours. Somewhere outside, men shout things like, "Blast the frost," and "Fetch the spanner." You, meanwhile, try not to breathe too hard because your breath immediately becomes visible and alarming. Welcome to the world's first delayed train service, circa 1852. Victorian railway companies were masters of understatement. When your train froze solid for 5 hours, the official notice board would calmly declare, "Slight delay due to weather." When the train was missing for a day and a half, it might read, "Service experiencing minor disruption." Public relations was invented early, so was sarcasm. Inside the carriages, conditions ranged from uncomfortable to biblical. Heating was a luxury reserved for first-class compartments, and even then it was usually a single tin stove that glowed bravely for 20 minutes before surrendering to the cold. Second- and third-class passengers huddled together like penguins with social anxiety. You could see your breath, feel your toes vanish, and listen to the sound of progress freezing in real time. In these moments, passengers became philosophers. Some stared gloomily at their fogged-up windows, composing mental complaints worthy of Dickens. Others tried to stay cheerful, declaring that it builds character. It didn't. The more inventive ones made jokes. "At least we're not walking," someone would mutter, which only reminded everyone that walking might actually be faster. The railway staff, meanwhile, became experts in creative delay explanations. Signal failure covered everything from snowed-in telegraph wires to missing station masters. Mechanical difficulty could mean anything from a frozen boiler to the engine driver accidentally setting fire to his own scarf. And obstruction on the line was a versatile favourite. It might be a snowdrift, a broken wheel, or occasionally an entire other train. But it wasn't just the trains that froze, it was the people running them. Station masters, bundled in coats and moral duty, stood on icy platforms making announcements no one could hear over the wind. Porters slipped, guards shouted, and somewhere in the chaos, a telegraph operator tapped out a desperate message. "Train delayed. Stop. Passengers mutinous. Stop. Sentee immediately. Stop." The delays could stretch into days. There were recorded instances of passengers trapped overnight, rationing biscuits and reading newspapers until the ink rubbed off on their gloves. Victorian papers loved these stories. "Adventure on the Midland Line," they'd exclaim, though the adventure mostly consisted of frostbite, boredom, and arguing over whether to eat the emergency ham sandwich now or later. One famously bad winter in 1867 saw hundreds of trains stranded across the country. Passengers were forced to sleep in carriages, where condensation froze on the inside of the windows and fell on them like tiny insults from nature. The lucky ones were rescued by nearby villagers who brought hot soup and pity. The unlucky ones spent the night counting icicles. Still, the British spirit endured. Complaints were delivered politely, in handwriting so neat it could freeze water. Letters poured into railway offices describing discomfort of a rare and enduring nature. Others took a more dramatic tone. We have suffered grievously and request compensation in the form of the immediate hot beverages. The railway companies, ever practical, developed entire departments for delay correspondence. Some even printed pre-written apology slips, the Victorian equivalent of "Your feedback is important to us." And so began the great cultural tradition of British delay etiquette. First you wait, then you complain, finally you forgive, until it happens again tomorrow. To be fair, rail delays weren't always caused by snow. Sometimes the train simply broke down, or livestock wandered onto the tracks, a surprisingly common event. But in winter the delays were biblical. Snow-filled tunnels, points froze, and signals vanished behind white curtains. Yet through it all, Victorians kept their faith in the timetable. There was something comforting about the illusion of order, even if the only thing running on time was disappointment. The irony was delicious. The Victorians had built the most advanced transportation network the world had ever seen, and it still ran on hope, coal and denial. They could calculate lunar eclipses and design bridges that defied gravity, but they couldn't keep a train on schedule in December. And deep down, they loved it. Because what's more British than apologising for the weather you invented an empire to avoid? So the next time your modern train stops in the middle of nowhere and the loudspeaker mutters something about temporary congestion, remember? Your great-grandfather sat there first, wrapped in a damp overcoat, inventing the phrase, "stuck again," with the same resigned dignity. The technology may have evolved, but the waiting and the complaining most never did. The good news? The train will eventually move. The bad news? Who will your patience? Before locomotives began puffing their way through the countryside, the Victorian traveller had only one real option for overland transport: the stagecoach. It was a romantic image in paintings, a gallant coach rolling through snow-capped hills, its driver stoic and the horses noble, but in reality it was more mobile misery with decorative wheels. Before the age of steam, winter travel meant surrendering to frost, fear, and the sound of wheels grinding through despair. Stagecoaches were the arteries of Britain's early travel network. They carried everything: people, mail, gossip, and the occasional chicken, over long distances at speeds that could best be described as optimistically brisk. In fair weather, they were already uncomfortable. Cramped compartments, muddy roads, and fellow passengers whose hygiene had long since declared independence. But when snow arrived, the entire system became an endurance trial. Avalanches blocked routes, horses refused to move, and frostbite became the unofficial ticket class everyone shared. A typical coach might hold 6 to 8 passengers inside, packed together like frozen sardines in layers of wool and regret. Those who couldn't afford a seat inside rode on the roof, yes, the roof, clinging to luggage, lanterns, and the faint hope of survival. In good weather, that was thrilling. In a blizzard, it was like signing up to be an icicle. Some men bragged they preferred the roof because the air was bracing. What they didn't mention was that their ears often didn't survive the journey. Drivers were hardy creatures, half navigator, half survivalist, part-time meteorologist. They knew every rut hedge and pub between London and Edinburgh, but even they feared snow. Icy roads turned every descent into a potential obituary. Horses, smart enough to know when conditions were hopeless, often stopped dead in protest. Horsepower might have powered the empire, but it came with opinions. One contemporary writer joked that the horses enjoyed better working conditions than the driver, and it wasn't far from the truth. They at least got blankets. When the snow grew thick, drivers carried shovels to dig the coach out, a task passengers were sometimes invited to assist with. The Victorian equivalent of forced team building. Many routes had emergency inns, little havens of warmth and smoke where travellers could thaw their limbs and debate whether to continue or die indoors. A roaring fire, a pint of something strong, and a promise to try again after the wind drops with an unofficial survival plan. And the roads, oh the roads. Before railways brought order, British highways were muddy ribbons of chaos. In winter they froze into treacherous slides. Wheel ruts filled with ice, bridges cracked, and the occasional shortcut became a frozen pond of doom. Coaches were often overturned, sometimes buried, occasionally eaten by snowdrifts. In 1814, one coach near Exeter reportedly disappeared into a drift so deep that only the coachman's whip was visible. He survived, barely, though it's unclear whether he ever spoke to his passengers again. Inside the coach, conditions were grimly comedic. Candles were fixed into little brackets on the walls for nighttime journeys, their flickering flames fighting a losing battle against drafts. When one went out mid-blizzard, it was less romantic and more panic in darkness. Conversation often turned fatalistic. How long until we reach the next post? If the horses don't freeze first. The scent was a mix of damp wool, pipe smoke and fear. Mail coaches were even more determined or deranged, depending on your perspective. These were the speed demons of the road, charged with delivering letters through weather that would make a saint swear. Drivers were armed and allowed to crack whips with the enthusiasm of a percussionist at war. But even they couldn't outrun winter. When snow blocked their way, the mail bags were sometimes carried on foot by postmen through miles of frozen landscape. Because, as the postal motto almost said, neither snow nor rain, except an avalanche. Accidents were inevitable. Wheels broke, axles snapped, and passengers were occasionally launched into snowbanks mid-journey. Some inns kept ledgers listing the number of overturned coaches they'd rescued that week, part of the charm apparently. Travellers with means often hired private coaches, believing, exclusivity might improve safety. It didn't. Snow was perfectly democratic in its cruelty. Yet despite the hardships, the stagecoach era had a strange gallantry to it. Every journey felt like an adventure, every survivor a storyteller. Writers like Dickens immortalised the image of snowbound travel, the crunch of hooves, the jingling harness, the glow of a distant inn. It looked glorious on paper and utterly miserable in person. Still, there was something undeniably human about it. The struggle, the camaraderie, the occasional shared flask passed between strangers who might never speak again after thawing out. When the railways finally arrived, travellers rejoiced. No more overturning coaches, no more freezing on rooftops, no more praying for the next inn to appear before frostbite did. But they also lost something, that raw, reckless heroism of battling nature face to face. In its own way, the stagecoach was the last gasp of adventure before travel became mechanical. So before you complain about your delayed train, imagine being stuck on a wooden box dragged by horses through waist-deep snow while your seatmate's candle sputters out and the driver shouts that the inn is only 6 more miles. Congratulations, you've just lived the pre-railway dream. The good news? The horses made it. The bad news? You didn't feel your toes again until spring. The Victorians prided themselves on reliability. The postal service was their crown jewel, fast, efficient and terrifyingly punctual. Letters zipped across Britain in record time, connecting London to Edinburgh faster than most people could find their other boot. But winter had no respect for the Queen's mail. When the snow came down, the mail coaches didn't just slow, they froze. The proud red vehicles that symbolised national communication became roadside sculptures of patriotic despair. Imagine the sight. A grand coach, emblazoned with the royal insignia, horses snorting plumes of steam into the frigid night, and inside sacks of letters slowly turning into paper popsicles. Drivers wrapped in wool and willpower lashed their teams forward, determined that neither snow nor rain would halt the post. But that motto, as it turned out, had an invisible footnote. Well, except this snow. Mail coaches were the Formula One racers of the stagecoach world. They were smaller, lighter, faster and utterly allergic to standing still. Unlike regular passenger coaches, They had priority on the roads, thundered through toll gates without stopping, and carried guards armed with pistols to ward off highwaymen. But none of that mattered when snow blocked the roads, froze the wheels, and filled the sky so thickly you couldn't tell the road from the field. The postal guard's pistol wasn't much use against nature unless you planned to duel the weather itself. The first sign of trouble came when the horses started slipping. The second sign was when the driver stopped swearing and began praying. Blizzards could hit without warning, transforming a clear route into a nightmare in minutes. Letters that had begun the journey dry and hopeful, love confessions, business proposals, overdue apologies, ended up damp, wrinkled, and occasionally fused together in the one tragic mass of frozen sentiment. Somewhere, a poor soul in Bath would never know that Aunt Mildred had forgiven him, because her forgiveness was now stuck to a block of sleet outside Birmingham. When coaches became trapped mid-route, it set off what the newspapers gleefully called postal panics. Entire districts would go days, sometimes weeks, without communication. The Victorians, who depended on daily correspondence like modern people depend on Wi-Fi, spiraled into existential crisis. No post today was the 19th century equivalent of the internet is down. Business halted, romances fizzled, and families had no idea if their distant relatives were alive, ill, or merely too cold to write. Mail guards took their duty seriously, sometimes too seriously. There are reports of guards abandoning immobilised coaches and trudging through miles of snow on foot, hauling sacks of letters across frozen fields just to deliver them on time. One heroic account tells of a guard who carried his postbag for 10 miles through a blizzard, only to arrive at the post office with icicles in his moustache and mail so stiff it could stand upright. The man was celebrated as a hero. The letters were celebrated as unopenable. The post office, ever concerned with reputation, refused to admit defeat. They issued bulletins filled with cautious optimism. The coach from York has been delayed, but we expect its safe arrival shortly. Translation: the coach is currently part of the landscape. Officials even experimented with horse relays to push through the snow, swapping out exhausted animals at frozen relay stations, while drivers thawed their hands over lanterns and pretended to feel their fingers. For towns cut off by snow, the mail delay was more than inconvenient. It was terrifying. News travelled by letter, and during winter, rumours took its place. Without official correspondence, small villages spiralled into speculation. The Queen has perished, one might claim. No, said another, the French have invaded Dover. Both wrong. It was just snow, but the silence made imaginations run wild. A postal freeze wasn't just a communications failure, it was a social collapse in miniature. And then there were the letters themselves. When eventually rescued, they arrived warped, smudged, and smelling faintly of horse sweat and smoke. Wax seals cracked, ink bled into Rorschach blots, and envelopes peeled apart like sad little snowflakes. The postman sorting them at destination offices had to unpeel correspondence carefully, trying to separate love letters from grocery orders. Some missives arrived so frost-damaged that people framed them as curiosities, Victorian paper fossils from the Great Snow Siege. Every now and then, a miracle occurred. A frozen mail coach would be dug out intact, its driver still alive and its horses steaming faintly like thawed bread loaves. Crowds would cheer as if victory over the weather had been achieved. The post office would announce, "The service has resumed," as if heroism, not desperation, were the motivating factor. The reality was simpler. Nobody wanted to explain to the Queen why her letters were still buried in Lincolnshire. By the late 1800s, when trains took over postal duties, Victorians thought the age of frozen letters was over. They were wrong. Railcars could freeze, telegraph wires could snap, and even modern innovations proved no match for a good British winter. The technology changed, the panic remained, but the legend of the snowbound mail coach endured, a symbol of the stubborn little empire that refused to stop delivering even when the mailbag was half iceberg. The good news? The mail eventually got through. The bad news? Your Valentine arrived in April, stiff as a plank and smelling faintly of horse. Before engines roared and rails gleamed, the true backbone of Victorian travel didn't puff smoke, it neighed. Horses were the unsung, frost-bitten heroes of winter travel, hauling people, parcels and national dignity through weather that would make even Queen Victoria mutter something unprintable. When trains froze and wheels jammed, horses still trudged forward, ears stiff, tails mummied with ice, and bells jingling, not out of cheer but out of mild equine resentment. These animals didn't sign up for it, literally. No contract, no overtime, no right to refuse service in case of blizzard. Their job was simple: pull. Their working conditions anything but. Victorian horses endured biting winds, blinding snow, and roads that alternated between slick ice and sucking mud. Their reward was a bucket of oats, a wet blanket, and perhaps, if their driver was sentimental, a pat on the nose that froze halfway through. The standard stagecoach team consisted of 4 to 6 horses, swapped every few miles at posting stations. These relays were critical, not for the comfort of passengers, but for the survival of the animals. Each horse could pull a heavy coach for only so long before exhaustion and frostbite took their toll. Postboys and ostlers at inns became part-time veterinarians, massaging frozen legs and rubbing warmth back into the hides of animals that looked more like exhausted ghosts than beasts of burden. Winter didn't just slow them down, it turned every trip into a test of nerve and footing. Icy roads could send an entire coach skidding sideways, the horses scrambling desperately to stay upright. A misstep meant disaster. One slip and a horse could fall, tangling reins, toppling the coach, and adding another headline to the ever-growing category of travel tragedy near York. The sound of horseshoes clattering on the frozen cobblestone was the soundtrack of winter, rhythmic, haunting, and occasionally followed by the sound of cursing drivers. Drivers and passengers alike depended on the horses' instincts. These creatures often knew the road better than the humans behind them. There are accounts of drivers blinded by blizzards letting go of the reins entirely, trusting the animals to find the path by memory or smell. And somehow they did, steady, deliberate, uncomplaining. In an age that worshipped machinery, the horse remained the only piece of technology that didn't require coal, only courage. But even courage needed accessories. Enter the winter wardrobe. Victorian horse fashion was unintentionally hilarious. Horses were draped in blankets, quilts, and woolly contraptions that made them look like walking wardrobes. Bells dangled from their harnesses, ostensibly to warn pedestrians, but also to stop the eerie silence of a snowstorm from driving travellers mad. A team jingling through the white landscape might sound festive to us, but to the horses, it was the sound of another long, freezing shift. Despite their endurance, many didn't make it. The combination of overwork, underfeeding, and relentless cold took a brutal toll. Frozen carcasses were sometimes found along the main roads, a grim reminder of how fragile progress could be. Stable hands at coaching inns worked through the night, thawing out water troughs and brushing ice from mains. Oats were rationed, blankets rotated, and every hoofprint in the snow was a small miracle of survival. Yet the Victorians adored their horses. They wrote poems about them, painted them heroically, and named them with affection: Blaze, Duke, Jenny, and Thunder. Postboys treated their favourites like comrades. There are recorded stories of drivers refusing to abandon their teams even when trapped in snowdrifts, choosing instead to huddle with the animals for warmth. Better company than most passengers, one was quoted as saying before spending the night spooning a horse named Molly. Horses didn't just pull people, they pulled the economy. Without them, mail stopped, trade froze, and cities grew sudden. Entire postal routes depended on their stamina. In a way, the Victorians' obsession with punctuality rested squarely on 4 hooves. The Empire's timetable was, quite literally, horse-powered. Every late delivery, every missed coach, could be traced back to an exhausted animal shivering under the yoke. The coming of the railway changed their fate, for better and worse. Many were retired to gentler farm work, though retired often meant reassigned to hauling coal carts. Still, the memory of those heroic beasts lingered. Even decades later, travellers spoke of them with awe, of the way their breath steamed in the moonlight, the way they trudged on when everything else failed, the way they seemed to embody that stubborn, unyielding British spirit. Cold, tired, but moving forward anyway. The next time someone romanticizes the golden age of travel, picture the horse who made it possible. Eyes crusted with frost, tail full of icicles, dragging a coach of sniffling Victorians toward the next inn. Progress looked majestic from the window seat. From the harness, it looked like overtime in a snowstorm. The good news? They were heroes of the road. The bad news? Their pension plan was hay. For the weary Victorian traveller, there was no sight more welcome than the dim glow of a lantern swinging above a roadside inn. After hours of jolting over frozen ruts, praying your coach wouldn't tip over, and wondering whether your toes were still attached, the promise of warmth and comfort sounded heavenly. Unfortunately, the average roadside inn delivered more smoke than warmth, and more fleas than comfort. The real luxury was simply not dying indoors. Victorian inns were the halfway houses between civilization and frostbite, part tavern, part stable, part accident waiting to happen. Their signs were cheerful: the Snowdrop Arms, the King's Rest, the Jolly Coachman. But their interiors usually looked like they'd been decorated by despair itself. Smoke billowed from the fireplace, draughty windows whistled like banshees, and the floorboards creaked ominously as if they were considering retirement. Still, to a traveller stumbling in from a blizzard, it was paradise on the technicality of having walls. The first order of business was thawing. Guests would crowd around the hearth, stamping their boots and shedding layers that emitted a suspiciously damp aroma. The fireplace roared, but mostly with smoke, because the chimney hadn't been cleaned since Napoleon was a concern. You could tell how long travellers had been waiting by the depth of the soot on their faces. A real British glow, they called it, though most would later realise they'd simply been mildly asphyxiated. Food was another adventure. The menu at a winter inn promised hearty fare, but reality often resembled an archaeological dig through something once edible. Stews simmered eternally, each day acquiring a new ingredient and losing its original purpose. Bread was warm in the middle and geological at the edges. The ale, at least, was plentiful and conveniently numbed the senses enough that guests mistook survival for satisfaction. As one traveller wrote, "The meal was dreadful, but at least it was warm, unlike everything else." Sleeping arrangements were a lottery of discomfort. Private rooms were rare, expensive, and only slightly less haunted than the communal ones. More often, travellers shared large attic dormitories with straw mattresses, threadbare blankets, and a chorus of soaring strangers. If you were lucky, your bed partner was merely loud. If unlucky, they were contagious. Cold draughts swept through gaps in the walls, while mice conducted nightly inspections of luggage. Yet, for all the misery, guests still described it as refreshing repose, proving that the Victorians would rather lie than admit defeat to weather. Downstairs, the tavern room offered a different kind of warmth, loud, smoky, and heavily fermented. Local farmers, drivers, and mail guards gathered there to swap stories, sing half-remembered songs, and argue over politics none of them understood. A single fiddler might play in the corner, his strings snapping mid-tune as the temperature dropped. The air was thick with tobacco, beer, and that unique Victorian blend of optimism and body odour. For travellers, it was the one place you could forget your frozen journey, at least until morning reminded you. Inns were also the nerve centres of winter communication. News travelled by coach, and innkeepers were unofficial postmasters, gossip columnists, and meteorologists all at once. They could tell you which routes were blocked, which drivers had overturned, and which passengers were still waiting for rescue somewhere between Hereford and eternity. Many hung chalkboards listing the latest arrivals and cancellations, the 19th century version of an airport departure screen, minus the functioning schedule. The staff themselves were hardened veterans of the cold. Innkeepers shuffled around in layers of wool, muttering about the worst winter since the last one. Stable boys worked through the night, tending horses, breaking ice off water troughs and occasionally defrosting a coachman. Maids aired out damp bedding over fires, which only made it smell like smoky damp bedding. Everyone looked permanently exhausted, but they kept the place running, just barely, because in winter, even mediocrity was survival. For all their flaws, roadside inns carried a kind of rough charm. They were social equalisers. Dukes and draymen might end up sharing the same ale and the same smoky air. Travellers forged fleeting friendships out of necessity, swapping tales, sharing blankets, and promising to meet again they rarely did. The road made everyone humble, and nothing built camaraderie quite like almost freezing to death together. The wealthy, of course, had options. Exclusive coaching inns along major routes, like the George in Stamford or the Bull in Rochester, offered relative luxury. Proper beds, clean sheets, and fires that burned something other than wet wood. But even there, comfort was inconsistent. One minute you were sipping port by the fire, the next you were dodging drips from a thawing roof beam. Victorian 5-star service meant your boots were defrosted before you wore them again. Still, these smoky, creaking establishments were the beating heart of winter travel. They kept the roads alive when everything else froze. Without them, the country would have ground to a halt, coaches stranded, passengers perishing, and horses wondering why humans couldn't hibernate. The inns might have been miserable, but they were necessary misery, the kind Britain specialised in. So yes, the soup was grey, the straw was damp, and the bedbugs charged rent, but you were indoors, breathing, mostly. And not frozen to a milestone somewhere between Oxford and oblivion. That, by Victorian standards, was comfort. The good news, you survived the night. The bad news, so did the mattress. If there's one thing the Victorians refused to let winter ruin, it was their sense of dignity, or at least the illusion of it. Temperatures could drop low enough to freeze ink in its bottle, but no self-respecting lady or gentleman was about to be seen shivering like a peasant. They didn't have Gore-Tex or thermal insulation. What they had was pride, wool, and enough layers to qualify as small architecture. Victorian winter fashion was less about comfort and more about moral fortitude. The era's guiding principle seemed to be, if you can still move your limbs, you're underdressed. It was a time when society believed suffering looked respectable. Men wrapped themselves in heavy greatcoats that could double as siege defences, while women swaddled themselves in shawls, cloaks, and the emotional weight of social expectation. The cold was an inconvenience. Being seen acknowledging it was a scandal. For women, winter travel outfits were feats of engineering. A proper lady layered chemise, corset, petticoats, bustle, underskirt, overskirt, cloak, bonnet, veil and gloves, each trapping just enough air to prevent death, while ensuring she could not, under any circumstance, bend at the waist. Fur muffs were essential, hand warmers the size of small pets, into which women stuffed their frozen fingers, and occasionally secret snacks for long journeys. A fashionable lady might resemble a well-upholstered sofa, but a dignified one. Hats and bonnets, meanwhile, were miniature tragedies. Made of straw, velvet or felt, they were pinned on with enough force to survive a hurricane, yet offered no actual warmth. Veils froze stiff in the wind, and feathers collected frost like festive decorations. Many a Victorian lady arrived at her destination resembling a very determined snowman, but fashion, as always, demanded sacrifice. One etiquette guide even warned that complaining of cold is unladylike, as if frostbite were a moral failing. Men's fashion wasn't much better. The top hat, that iconic pillar of Victorian masculinity, turned into a personal ice bucket in winter. Gentlemen swore by the greatcoat, enormous garments of wool or camel hair, often weighing as much as a toddler, and absorbing snow with enthusiasm. Beneath, waistcoats and cravats offered no insulation but immense style points. Gloves were mandatory, though they tended to freeze into elegant hand-shaped fossils. The truly brave sported fur collars and cuffs, not for warmth but to announce, I could afford something that used to move. Travellers often resorted to improvisation. Newspaper stuffed into the boots provided surprising insulation, and bonus reading material if you got stuck. Wool scarves doubled as face masks long before the concept became fashionable again. On long coach journeys, some men wore travelling wrappers, essentially giant shawls for men who pretended not to notice they were wearing blankets in public. Even so, most still looked like badly wrapped presents by the time they arrived anywhere. Children were not spared the ordeal. Bundled within an inch of mobility, they looked like miniature snow fortresses with mittens. Illustrations from the era show families departing for winter outings in coordinated misery, cheeks rosy, smiles forced, layers infinite. The family dog, usually the only creature dressed sensibly by nature, looked smug. Material innovation lagged far behind fashion's vanity. Waterproofing was primitive. Oilcloth cloaks helped repel rain but turned wearers into walking candles near open flames. Wool was the main defence, thick, scratchy and proud of it. The wealthy flaunted fur to ermine, mink, beaver and even seal, not so much for warmth as for superiority. Nothing said comfort like draping yourself in the formerly alive. And then there were the boots, triumphs of style, tragedies of practicality. Ladies' button boots were dainty marvels of leather and vanity, impossible to remove without a servant and utterly unsuited to snow. Gentlemen's boots fared slightly better, though even the sturdiest pair couldn't save them from slush. A day's journey meant returning home with damp socks, ruined soles, and the quiet satisfaction of having looked respectable while freezing. Public opinion played a key role in this madness. To look warm was to appear lazy. A traveller bundled beyond recognition risked whispers of weakness. Endurance was fashionable. The ideal Victorian traveller looked perfectly composite, even while their eyelashes froze together. Newspapers occasionally praised the English constitution for enduring the cold with grace, conveniently forgetting that most of the population was doing so out of poverty, not patriotism. Still, there was something admirable in their stubbornness. Against all reason, the Victorians turned endurance into art. They stood in snowstorms like statues, drank tea in sub-zero rooms, and declared it invigorating. Their travel diaries rarely admitted defeat. Instead, they chronicled frostbite as a rather sharp inconvenience. And when railways introduced heated carriages toward the century's end, many called it decadent. Comfort apparently was un-English, so no, they didn't have insulated coats or moisture-wicking socks. What they had was sheer defiance, and a wardrobe that could double as fortification. They met the blizzards head-on, armed with fur, starch and social pressure, determined to prove that style was stronger than science. The good news? They looked magnificent in portraits. The bad news? Every portrait lied. No one that elegant ever survived January. If frost were democratic, the Victorians might have endured winter in solidarity. Alas, even the weather had a social hierarchy. A blizzard may have blanketed everyone equally, but class determined what kind of blanket you had: wool, horsehair, or sheer optimism. On the rails or the road, the divide between first-class and third-class passengers wasn't measured in inches or miles. It was measured in warmth. The temperature may have been equal, but the suffering was not. Let's start with the first-class traveller, the crowned penguin of the transport world. Wrapped in fur-lined coats and moral superiority, they occupied the finest carriages with velvet seats and brass fixtures that gleamed faintly beneath the frost. Their compartments were occasionally heated, though heated in Victorian terms meant a small coal brazier that coughed out more smoke than warmth. Still, they had glass windows sometimes, foot warmers filled with hot water if the staff remembered, and most importantly, privacy, allowing them to freeze in peace rather than in company. These elite passengers approached winter discomfort as a kind of performance art. They would sip brandy from silver flasks, discuss politics between shivers, and insist the cold was refreshing. To admit otherwise would be unseemly. When trains stalled or coaches stopped mid-blizzard, they sent for porters, demanded tea, and lamented the inefficiency of nature. Their suffering was elegant, curated even, with layers of etiquette cushioning every complaint. The frost might bite, but class bit harder. Meanwhile, third-class passengers endured the same journey from inside what could only be described as the industrial refrigerators on wheels. The cheap seats had no heat, no cushions, and occasionally no roof. You bought a ticket for transportation, not survival. Wooden benches, iron walls, and gaps wide enough for wind to whistle symphonies through. This was economy travel, Victorian style. Open carriages were exactly that. Open to the elements, the birds, and the full cruelty of British winter. Working-class travellers brought their own survival kits. Shawls, blankets, scarves, and a flask of something flammable if fortune allowed. Families huddled together, breathing steam into the air like exhausted kettles. If someone fainted from the cold, fellow passengers offered sympathy, not medical aid. There was no room to lie down anyway. And yet, there was camaraderie here that no first-class compartment could replicate. In the cheap seats, warmth came not from coal, but from shared misery. Stagecoaches offered a similar contrast. The wealthy could book interior seats, still cold, but protected from the wind. The poor rode on top, exposed to every icy gust and stray snowflake. Horses slipped, passengers clung, and frost crept through every seam. One unlucky traveller wrote that his eyelashes froze together mid-sentence. Another noted that after a long journey, his coat was so stiff with ice that he had to be thawed before removing it. Yet tickets for the roof were cheaper, and necessity always trumped comfort. The railways, for all their modernity, reinforced this divide. First-class compartments boasted soft lamps and padded upholstery. Second class offered compromise, fewer frills, slightly less frostbite. Third class was a statement of endurance. Passengers carried their own straw or newspaper to sit on, partly for insulation, partly to prevent splinters. The carriages were unlit, unheated, and so bare they made barns look luxurious. Yet the railway companies insisted this was adequate accommodation for the working man. When snowstorms struck, the class system became even more absurd. First-class passengers complained of delays and demanded compensation. Third-class passengers simply hoped they'd survive to demand anything at all. The wealthy could afford patience, or port wine. The poor could afford neither. If trains stalled for hours, servants were sent to fetch hot drinks for their masters, while labourers resorted to stamping their feet until circulation returned. In some stranded carriages, first-class travellers toasted British resilience, while third-class travellers burned bits of luggage to keep their fingers. It wasn't just travel that exposed this divide, it was ideology. The Victorians believed hardship built character, but only when endured by the lower classes. The poor were expected to brave the cold with cheerful stoicism. The rich were applauded for tolerating a mild draught. Charitable societies might hand out coal or blankets, but moralists warned against pampering the poor, as if warmth itself were a slippery slope toward moral decay. One social critic even suggested that frost is God's equalizer, which was easy to say when your fireplace had 12 feet of marble around it. Still, there were moments when the cold briefly dissolved these distinctions. When trains froze mid-route or coaches overturned in the snow, everyone, duchess and dock worker alike, was suddenly human. They shared blankets, curses, and brandy with the same desperation. And while the rich would later recount these stories as adventures, the poor would simply call them Wednesday. By the late century, reforms began to close the gap. Third-class carriages gained roofs, glass windows, and, eventually, heating. The working classes could finally travel without the added challenge of hypothermia. But the social chill never quite thawed. Even in warmth, Victorians managed to find new ways to divide themselves. Who had fancier gloves, thicker coats, or more stoic expressions? So yes, the frost covered everyone equally. But in a nation obsessed with hierarchy, even the weather learned its manners. The upper classes froze with dignity, the lower froze with honesty. The only real equality came when the tea froze solid. The good news? Everyone got there eventually. The bad news? Some arrived slightly more blue than others. Every Victorian winter eventually produced its masterpiece, the snowed-in train. It was the grandest performance the weather could stage, part endurance test, part social experiment. Picture a steam engine proudly charging through the countryside, plumes of white smoke curling into the grey sky, only to vanish beneath a mountain of snow somewhere between nowhere and help. Entire trains froze in place for days, turning passengers into unwilling housemates and railway carriages into accidental villages. It was Downton Abbey meets Lord of the Flies, with less food and considerably worse hygiene. When the first flakes fell, optimism ran high. "A brief delay," the guard would say. "Just a drift or two ahead." Then came the long pause, minutes stretching into hours as the view outside transformed into a white abyss. Passengers stared through frosted glass at nothing but silence and snow. It was the 19th century version of being stuck on a broken elevator, except with more layers and fewer safety regulations. The earliest snowed-in incidents became instant news sensations. Victorians adored a good disaster story, especially if it involved middle-class people suffering politely. Newspapers breathlessly reported train marooned for 48 hours near Crewe, or passengers imprisoned by snowdrift, spirits remarkably high. The last part was never true. Spirits were not high. Spirits were gone, unless someone had the foresight to bring actual spirits. Inside the carriages, the mood followed a predictable arc. Stage 1, mild inconvenience handled with dignity. Stage 2, creative complaining. Stage 3, moral collapse. When food ran low and fires burned out, the veneer of civility thawed faster than anyone's boots. Strangers who had exchanged polite nods at the station were now huddled together for warmth, sharing biscuits and secrets. The class system blurred under the frost. By the second night, even first-class passengers accepted that brandy shared was brandy multiplied. Of course, the railway staff bore the brunt of the blame and the frostbite. Drivers and guards trudged through waist-deep snow in search of help, their uniforms stiff with ice, lanterns barely visible in the storm. Some walked miles to the nearest signal box, leaving behind passengers who debated whether to cheer or mutiny. Railway companies, terrified of bad press, insisted everything was under control, which in Victorian English translated roughly to "please stop panicking." Conditions inside those immobilised trains were grim comedy. Heating was a fantasy, coal supplies dwindled quickly, and the windows intended to keep out soot now trapped condensation that froze into glittering sheets. When passengers exhaled, their breath turned to frost that decorated the ceiling like festive misery. Toilets froze, sandwiches froze, people froze, though at least everyone looked equally radiant under a sheen of frostbite. Some passengers wrote letters from inside their trapped carriages, chronicling the absurdity with stiff-fingered determination. "We have been immovable these 3 days," wrote one in 1881, "and morale remains tolerable, though the soup has become a moral dilemma." Another diarist noted, "Conversation has turned from weather to cannibalism in jest, though one cannot help but notice who's being eyed most hungrily." Victorian humour, even at sub-zero temperatures, was indestructible. Railway companies eventually dispatched rescue trains, heroic in concept, disastrous in execution. Many became stuck themselves, joining their stranded brethren in a growing sculpture of industrial defeat. When that failed, local villagers stepped in, trekking across the drifts with baskets of food, blankets, and scalding tea. These rescues became community legends. Entire parishes turned out to dig, and somewhere in every account is a vicar giving moral encouragement while contributing absolutely no manual labour. Despite the suffering, there was something almost theatrical about it all. Snowed-in passengers improvised routines to pass the time, reading, singing hymns, or speculating which hour their sanity would depart. In some cases, people grew fond of their temporary imprisonment. When finally rescued, they exchanged addresses and promised lifelong friendships, though one suspects most quietly hoped never to see each other again. Each major snow entrapment became a national lesson, prompting new railway reforms. companies began storing emergency provisions, reinforcing plough engines, and issuing sturdier clothing for staff. But none of it truly tamed the weather. Every decade brought a new, worst snowstorm in living memory, and with it, a fresh batch of passengers forced to rediscover just how little comfort existed between progress and panic. The photographs that survive, ghostly images of locomotives half submerged in snow, capture the contradiction of the age, Britain's pride in its technology, humbled by nature's indifference. Steam power could move mountains, but it couldn't move through 6 feet of frozen humility. In the end, every snowed-in train told the same story: human confidence meeting natural consequence. The Victorians endured it with tea, temper, and the unshakable belief that next time would surely be different. It rarely was, but it made for a cracking headline, and an even better fireside story once everyone had thawed. The good news, you survived the blizzard. The bad news, you now know exactly how long 48 hours can feel when shared with 12 strangers, a dead fire, and a single remaining sandwich. Behind every nose-chalked railway and frostbitten timetable stood a handful of overworked men armed with shovels, soot-streaked faces, and the unspoken motto, "Keep the miracle running even if it's frozen solid." These were the unsung heroes of Victorian winter travel, engineers, stokers and guards who quite literally kept Britain's industrial heart from icing over. While passengers grumbled and the upper classes clinked their flasks, these men were outside in the storm battling the elements with tools better suited for gardening than warfare. The Victorian railway system was a mechanical marvel, but one that needed constant back-breaking attention to keep alive. Steam engines didn't politely ask to be warmed up, they demanded coaxing, feeding and cajoling like enormous temperamental pets. When snow and ice entered the equation, their moods soured dramatically. Boilers clogged, pistons froze and pipes burst in symphonies of hissing steam. It fell to the railway crew, those soot-blackened figures who smelled permanently of coal smoke and despair, to make the impossible work anyway. First came the engine drivers, stoic, soot-smeared captains of the Iron Road. Their world was one of noise, heat and danger, even in fair weather. In winter, they drove blind through blizzards, peering out through half-frozen goggles while the wind clawed at their faces. One driver described the experience as like steering a volcano through a snowstorm. Visibility was often zero. Instinct and sheer stubbornness replaced sight. They memorized every mile of track, every curve, every signal box, because in a whiteout the landscape vanished completely. Then there were the stokers, the muscular magicians who kept the fire alive. Their work was pure punishment, shoveling coal into the furnace for hours, drenched in sweat despite the freezing air outside. Their job was to maintain the perfect pressure in the boiler. Too little, and the train stalled. Too much, and it might explode. Steam hissed, water spat, and the temperature swung between tropical and tundra. When the firebox door opened, the stoker's face glowed like a forge. When it closed, frost crept back in. Every successful journey was paid for in soot-stained lungs and singed eyebrows. Out on the line, trackmen and engineers waged their own losing battle. Snowdrifts buried the rails faster than they could dig them out. With no mechanical snowplows in the early years, entire gangs of men cleared miles of track with nothing but shovels, pickaxes, and complaints. They'd walk the line at dawn, stamping their boots and cursing the cold, while the snow fell faster than they could remove it. Sometimes they built bonfires along the rails to thaw the switches, a risky manoeuvre that combined the worst parts of railway maintenance and accidental arson. Guards were the bridge between chaos and the public, the uniformed diplomats of disaster. When trains stalled in snowdrifts, it was the guards' job to keep passengers calm and delusionally hopeful. "We'll be moving shortly," they'd declare, though shortly might mean before the next geological era. They fetched tea when possible, distributed blankets when available, and issued reassurances when they could think of any. It was public relations before the phrase existed. Customer service performed in sleet. Winter also introduced a new enemy: frozen signals. Semaphore arms jammed mid-air, rendering communication between stations a guessing game. Telegraph wires snapped under ice, leaving entire regions blind. The crew had to rely on intuition, whistles, and hand signals in near-zero visibility. Not ideal when your job involves steering multi-ton engines past one another at 30 miles an hour. Mistakes were costly, and yet, through a mix of discipline and sheer luck, disaster was often averted. The working conditions bordered on lunacy. Frostbite, burns, and exhaustion were occupational hazards. Gloves were useless, they froze stiff, so men handled metal with bare hands, leaving skin behind like a grim calling card. Food was whatever could be eaten one-handed between shovelfuls of coal, bread, cold meat, maybe a miracle flask of tea if someone's wife had packed kindly. Pay was meagre, praise rarer still. If everything went right, the public said nothing. If one train ran late, the papers screamed. Yet despite it all, the crews kept going. Pride held them upright when the weather tried to knock them down. They saw themselves as part of something larger, a living machine that connected the nation. Every train that rolled into a station on time was proof of their triumph over both engineering and entropy. When blizzards paralysed lesser systems, British railwaymen dug in, quite literally, and made the miracle move again. By the late 19th century, railway companies began issuing official winter gear, heavy wool coats, oiled hats, and boots lined with sheepskin. None of it worked particularly well, but it was the thought that counted. In photos from the period, crews stand proudly beside their engines, half frozen but smiling faintly, not because they were warm, but because the camera exposure took 3 minutes and they'd forgotten how to frown. In truth, these men were the spine of Victorian progress. Without them, the Empire's trains, mail and passengers would have frozen mid-journey, monuments to overconfidence. Their endurance transformed inconvenience into inevitability. Of course the train would run, even through snow, because the crew refused to let it stop. The good news? They kept the nation moving. The bad news? They were usually moving in sub-zero temperatures with coal dust in their teeth and frost on their soles. If the Victorians had invented clickbait, it would have worn a top hat and smelled faintly of printer's ink. For them, few things sold papers faster than disaster, and winter provided an annual subscription. Every snowstorm became a stage play in print, a saga of stranded travellers, noble rescues, and righteous indignation. When it came to snow, Victorian newspapers had 2 settings, glory and outrage. It was front page, weather, again. The daily press in the 19th century was a beast forever hungry for sensation, and winter fed it well. Readers craved drama. The worse the storm, the better the story. When trains froze, journalists pounced. Headlines screamed, "Frozen Express in the North, Mail Coach Buried, Heroism in the Snow," or the ever-reliable, unprecedented weather disrupts the kingdom. The word unprecedented appeared so often it might as well have been a snowflake itself. Inside those bold titles came breathless accounts that blurred fact and melodrama. A stranded passenger might become a survivor of Arctic privation. A guard handing out tea became a hero of the rails. Villagers who helped dig out trains were portrayed as brave rustics defying nature. And of course, someone always wept tears of joy at being rescued, whether they actually did or not. It wasn't just reporting, it was national theatre printed in black and white. London papers dispatched correspondents to frozen outposts like York, Leeds, or the Scottish border, which to the average Londoner might as well have been the North Pole. These field reporters wrote by candlelight in chilly inns, sending dispatches by telegraph when it worked, describing blinding blizzards and frozen legions of commerce. Sometimes they exaggerated so wildly that locals barely recognised the events. A mild frost in Derbyshire might be reimagined as a calamity of glacial proportions. Truth may have melted, but circulation soared. Of course, not every newspaper found heroism in hardship. Many preferred outrage, that timeless British pastime. The Times and Morning Chronicle routinely blamed railway companies for being ill-prepared for the inclemency of the season. Editorials scolded engineers, drivers, even nature itself for failing to anticipate snow in winter. Readers were outraged at the very idea that Britain, the empire of progress, could be inconvenienced by something as common as weather. Letters to editors poured in, dripping with indignation. "Sir," one citizen would write, "I have been delayed 3 hours by snow on the Great Northern Line. I demand to know whether the directors of that establishment intend to invest in shovels." Another fumed. "Is there no remedy for the public discomfort caused by meteorological incompetence? To the Victorian mind, snow was not a natural event. It was a bureaucratic failure." When not berating railways, the press blamed the government. Politicians were accused of neglecting the national question of weather preparedness. There were proposals for official snow inspectors, frost commissions, and even a minister for the season. Nothing came of it, of course. The snow melted before Parliament could agree on the definition of frost. Still, the papers played an essential role in shaping public memory. Through their pages, the harshness of winter became a spectacle of moral endurance. Every storm became a sermon about British fortitude. Readers thrilled to stories of guards trudging through snow to deliver mail, or villagers digging out stranded travellers with courage befitting ancient Rome. The message was clear. The weather might win the battle, but Britain would win the paragraph. Illustrated papers like the Graphic and the Illustrated London News added drama with engravings that made every snowstorm look like a biblical epic. Artists portrayed locomotives buried in glittering drifts, stoic men wielding shovels, and women gazing heroically from carriage windows as if posing for martyrdom. These images turned mundane misfortune into frozen legend. In reality, most passengers were cold, bored, and quietly regretting their life choices. Meanwhile, smaller regional papers took pride in local valour. A Lancashire journal might proclaim, "Our townsfolk defied the blizzard," while a rival in Yorkshire declared, "Our townsfolk defied it better." Provincial rivalry thrived in sub-zero temperatures. If one village rescued a train, neighbouring parishes immediately tried to outdo them by rescuing two. The competition for moral superiority was as fierce as the storm itself. And yet, there was humour too. The Punch magazine, Victorian Britain's patron saint of satire, mocked the chaos mercilessly. Cartoons depicted railway directors skiing to work or passengers turning into icicles while station masters sipped tea. One cartoon showed Britannia herself shaking her fist at the sky with the caption, "Really, this is quite un-English." Even misery, it seemed, could be monetised through laughter. When the thaw finally came, the papers shifted tone. Yesterday's villains became heroes. Railway men once accused of incompetence were now praised for endurance. They faced nature's wrath and prevailed, declared the same editor who had spent last week calling them nincompoops. It was journalism's oldest magic trick, rewriting history before the ink dried. By spring, the drama faded, the presses cooled, and readers turned to other crises: cholera, elections, or the eternal scandal of someone marrying beneath their station. But the pattern would repeat next winter. Snow, chaos, outrage, redemption. The Victorians may have invented industrial progress, but they also perfected something far more enduring: the 24-hour complaint cycle. The good news, the papers sold well. The bad news, so did the weather. Nothing revealed Victorian optimism quite like their attempts to scientifically defeat snow. Faced with drifts the size of cottages and locomotives frozen in place, the age of invention rolled up its sleeves and declared war on winter. The result? A glorious parade of contraptions that ranged from mildly effective to outright absurd, all underpinned by one unshakable belief: if you throw enough steam, brass, and hubris at nature, nature will eventually surrender. Spoiler, it did not. The first challenge was simple in theory: keep the railways clear. In practice, it was like asking an umbrella to hold off a glacier. Early railway companies turned to brute force: armies of men with shovels trudging along the tracks, scraping, hacking and cursing. It was slow, back-breaking work, and no matter how fast they shovelled, snow fell faster. One observer in the 1850s described the effort as a splendid display of futility. Engineers, however, refused to let manual labour have all the glory. By mid-century, the railways began experimenting with mechanical solutions. Enter the snowplough engine, an iron wedge bolted to the front of a locomotive, designed to blast through drifts with the subtlety of a battering ram. When it worked, it was magnificent, a plume of white exploding from the tracks as the train thundered through. When it didn't, the plough buried itself and the rescuers had to be rescued. One journalist dryly noted, "The device has cleared everything except the difficulty. Different companies tried different designs. Some fitted rotary ploughs with enormous spinning blades meant to chew through snow like a windmill possessed by rage. These machines looked terrifying and sounded worse, a roaring blend of gears, steam and bad decisions. They worked beautifully in Canada and the American Midwest, but on Britain's narrow tracks, they mostly succeeded in scattering snow into neighbouring counties. Then there were the fire-based solutions, because nothing says progress like setting fire to the problem. The logic was simple. If snow freezes, melt it. Railway workers tried everything from flaming torches to portable furnaces set along the rails. Some crews even poured oil on the snow before lighting it, turning entire railway stretches into reluctant bonfires. Passengers waiting in nearby stations watched as the night sky glowed orange, comforted by the thought that someone, somewhere, was definitely violating a safety regulation. Fire hoses also made an appearance. A few inventive souls proposed using high-pressure steam jets to blast the snow away. The result was an impressive display of scalded snow and equally scalded workmen. Others favoured water hoses, which worked fine until the water froze mid-air, encasing everything in a glassy layer of irony. Victorian ingenuity, it seemed, had a knack for solving one problem by creating two others. In the cities, street clearing followed its own chaotic science. Municipal crews used shovels, brooms, and horse-drawn scrapers to push snow into enormous heaps, which were then piled in the middle of the road, effectively transferring the danger from pedestrians to carriages. In London, where melting snow turned instantly to black sludge, the solution was simple: dump it in the Thames, out of sight, out of smell. By February, the river resembled an unappetizing slushy. Inventors across Britain and the continent joined the battle, submitting patents for snow-melting contrivances that promised frictionless clearance by chemical or electrical means. One gentleman from Leeds proposed a contraption that combined a plough, broom and flamethrower. Another patented a rotating railway sweeper powered by wind, a charming idea that failed whenever there wasn't any. Some designs looked more suited to battlefields than train yards. The line between progress and pyromania was thin and frequently crossed. Even householders got in on the mania. The Illustrated London News advertised home-use snow melters, small coal-fueled devices designed to banish frost from pathways and bring joy to the domestic threshold. Most smoked furiously and cracked the pavement. Children found them till they exploded. The Victorians, to their credit, never let failure slow them down. Each mishap was merely proof that science needed more funding. By the 1870s and 1880s, the railway settled on a mix of mechanical ploughs and human perseverance. Crews stationed along key routes kept ready-made snow trains, engines equipped with ploughs, spare coal and coffee strong enough to dissolve spoons. When storms hit, they thundered forth to battle the drifts, their whistles echoing through the white void. It was half engineering, half performance art. Passengers often gathered at stations just to watch these iron beasts roar into the storm like heroes from a penny novel. Of course, success was relative. For every mile cleared, another was buried again by wind. Snow laughed at timetables, but through these endless skirmishes, the Victorians achieved something remarkable. Not total victory, but a kind of elegant persistence. They might not have beaten winter, but they learned how to fight it stylishly, with invention, enthusiasm, and the occasional open flame. By century's end, improved drainage, raised embankments, and heavier locomotives made travel slightly more reliable, though the occasional snowed-in train still delighted newspaper editors and horrified passengers. The true miracle wasn't that the Victorians cleared the snow, it's that they kept trying long after common sense had gone home to warm its feet. The good news? They never stopped innovating. The bad news? Neither did the snow. If the railway was the body of Victorian progress, the telegraph was its nervous system, a quick, miraculous, and prone to breaking down in the cold. It connected cities, businesses, and hearts faster than anything before it. Messages that once took days could now flash across the country in minutes, but when winter came and ice clung to the wires like gossip to a drawing room, Britain's proud new nervous system went numb. The nation's social network went down, and Victorians had to talk in person. Horrifying. The telegraph was, in its time, the closest thing to magic. It hummed with electric possibility, until frost turned its miracle into misery. The system depended on miles upon miles of exposed wire strung along wooden poles that cut through fields, forests and moors. In fine weather, they carried the pulse of the empire. In a snowstorm, they carried frost, icicles, and the sound of operators swearing softly into their mittens. Ice was the telegraph's natural enemy. It thickened on the wires, weighing them down until they sagged or snapped entirely. Gusts of wind turned those frozen strands into deadly whips that could tear free from poles and lash across roads like vengeful ribbons. A single storm could silence half the country. In the winter of 1860, entire sections of the Great Northern Telegraph were struck dumb, as one newspaper poetically put it, though the linemen repairing it were decidedly not dumb in their commentary. When the lines went dead, the consequences rippled outward like, well, an electric shock. Business transactions halted. Stock exchanges paused, trembling more from silence than frost. Railway dispatchers lost communication with distant stations, forcing them to rely on hand signals and blind faith. Politicians fumed that the arteries of commerce are frozen. One wit observed that London now knows less of Manchester than of Mars. And then there was the public. Victorians had grown addicted to telegrams. They used them for everything, arranging meetings, declaring love, spreading gossip, and sending condolences, sometimes all in the same message. To be cut off was a national crisis. No wires, no word, no world, lamented one columnist. Newspapers, robbed of their telegraphed news from abroad, printed apologies and speculation instead. The result was Victorian fake news, entire stories built from rumour, wishful thinking, and whichever reporter was brave enough to open a window and guess the weather. The telegraph offices themselves became winter battlefields. Operators worked wrapped in shawls and overcoats, their breath fogging the glass as they tapped out fragments of half-frozen communication. Metal keys stuck. The spark of transmission sputtered, and electric current weakened in the cold. Even when messages got through, they sometimes arrived mangled, like a drunk game of Morse code telephone. One London office reportedly received a garbled signal that read, "OCK down." "Dock up. Queen," prompting both panic on the trading floor and mild concern at Buckingham Palace. Repair crews were the unseen heroes of this frozen drama. Linemen trudged through snowdrifts to reach broken poles, armed with little more than spools of wire, spanners, and extremely bad luck. They scaled icy poles while winds howled like banshees, patching together lines that immediately froze again. Their work was thankless and dangerous. Many were electrocuted, frozen, or both. But without them, Britain's great conversation would have stayed frozen indefinitely. And yet, even in crisis, the Victorians refused to let silence win. Newspapers printed telegraphless editions filled with moral essays and poetry about resilience. Town criers re-emerged, bellowing updates through the streets as if time had rolled backward a century. Letters briefly reclaimed their former glory, until snowdrifts halted the post too. It was communication's perfect storm, a nation of chatterboxes forced to listen to themselves. The social effects were almost comic. One diarist in 1879 wrote, "The absence of telegrams has restored conversation, which I confess I find quite fatiguing. Without the telegraph, gossip slowed to a crawl, leaving salons eerily quiet. Lovers, unable to exchange hasty telegrams, were forced to write long, handwritten letters, and then wait a week for delivery. More than one courtship reportedly froze solid in the interim. The government, of course, tried to intervene. Committees were formed, reports were written. Experts suggested heating telegraph wires with steam or insulating them with India rubber. Both ideas worked beautifully on paper and disastrously in practice. Heated wires melted the snow briefly before catching fire. Rubber insulation cracked in the cold. The only solution that reliably worked was the least scientific: wait for spring. By the late century, improvements were made. Heavier poles, stronger copper lines, and protective coatings helped minimise winter failures. Underground cables eventually replaced many exposed wires, ensuring that Britain's voice could survive even the frostiest January. But for decades, every snowstorm still carried the same risk, not just of isolation, but of public anxiety. The Victorians had built the fastest communication system in history, only to discover it had the same weakness as its users. It couldn't handle the cold shoulder. When the thaw finally came, telegrams once again zipped across the land, business resumed, gossip bloomed, and lovers sighed in relief. The crisis was over until next winter. But the memory lingered, that eerie quiet, that hum of silence where the voice of progress should have been. It reminded Victorians of something they'd rather forget, that for all their wires and wheels, they were still at the mercy of the weather. The good news, Britain was talking again. The bad news, so were the newspapers. When Victorians imagined the romance of rail travel, they pictured speed, luxury and adventure, not gnawing on a biscuit that predated the train itself. But when snow stopped the wheels of progress, mealtime became a battle of creativity and survival. There was no dining car, no catering service, and definitely no refund. If your train was trapped for a day or two, or 5, and your menu consisted of whatever you'd brought, whatever you could share, and whatever didn't freeze solid first. Welcome to culinary innovation by necessity, tea à la icicle. Victorian travel was never famous for its cuisine, even on a good day. Most passengers brought their own food, packed carefully into tin boxes and wax paper, cold meats, bread, pickles, and the ever-reliable travelling biscuit, which had the consistency and charm of roof tiles. But when the snow trapped trains for days, these modest lunches transformed into the nation's most desperate banquets. The phrase packed provisions began to sound suspiciously optimistic once you were rationing crumbs. The first few hours of delay were manageable. People nibbled sandwiches and sipped lukewarm tea from flasks, making polite conversation through chattering teeth. But as hours turned into days, the arithmetic of appetite began. Couples argued over the last sausage roll. Strangers eyed one another's baskets like rival merchants on a desert island. The well-prepared were suddenly celebrities. Those who'd packed nothing but optimism found themselves rethinking their life choices and staring a little too long at the fruitcake 3 rows down. Food froze fast. Apples turned to cannonballs, meat stiffened into geological samples, and even the humble bread roll became a weapon-grade object. One gentleman stuck his knife into a loaf only to have both snap in half. "At least it saves slicing," he noted grimly. Passengers soon realised that their greatest enemy wasn't hunger, it was temperature. By the second day, even the word picnic felt like an insult. The only true salvation was tea, that national cure for disaster. Of course, with no boiling water or functioning engine. Brewing a pot required creativity bordering on madness. Ingenious travellers melted snow over candle flames, balancing teapots precariously on window ledges while reciting prayers to St. Caffeine. The results were variable. Some achieved lukewarm success. Others produced beverages tasting faintly of soot, desperation, and moral victory. Thus was born the unofficial drink of the stranded, tea à la icicle. Guards and railway crew often played impromptu chefs, sharing their own supplies with passengers. Coal-fired stoves from the engine could sometimes be coaxed into heating tins of soup or warming milk. The smell of anything edible wafting through the carriages turned otherwise polite Victorians into hungry wolves. Offers of trade followed. Half a biscuit for a sip of tea, one glove for a slice of ham, my eternal gratitude for a raisin. By day 3, gratitude had no market value. When supplies finally ran out, passengers improvised with alarming creativity. Snow was melted for drinking water, though it usually came with a side of soot. Sugar lumps were shared like currency. One account from 1881 tells of passengers trapped near Carlisle who collectively made a stew out of their combined resources: ham, onion, biscuit crumbs, and one brave soul's pickle jar. The results were regrettable but filling. It was the world's first pop-up dining experience, minus the hygiene. Some passengers found humour in the misery. Newspapers later published letters from survivors describing their ordeal with gallows wit. "We dined magnificently upon our third biscuit," wrote one. "It was unanimous that we would have preferred the second." Another reported that a fellow traveller attempted to toast bread by holding it near the carriage's gas lamp, only to set his cuff ablaze. Progress, it seemed, had found a way to combine starvation and fire hazard in one elegant package. Luxury travellers fared only slightly better. First-class passengers, accustomed to dining with silverware, found themselves gnawing cold beef off tin plates with the rest of humanity. One lady of refinement wrote afterward that she'd never felt so democratic in her life. Champagne froze, pudding shattered, and fine china clinked sadly in the frost. For a brief freezing moment, Britain achieved perfect social equality. Everyone was hungry, and everyone's tea tasted like melted disappointment. Rescue, when it came, was often heralded by the smell of warm food, usually soup or broth brought by the local villagers or railway workers. Those who had spent 2 days chewing on cold rations wept openly at the sight of steam. Children were revived with hot milk, adults with something stronger. The first sip of something warm after days of cold was reportedly enough to make people cry, laugh, and propose marriage to the person holding the ladle. When passengers finally reached their destinations, their stomachs were empty, but their stories full. Newspapers, ever the opportunists, seized on their suffering. "Travellers starve on the Midland Line," one headline declared, conveniently ignoring that most had survived on biscuits and melodrama. Others called for railway reforms, demanding emergency food depots at stations, a suggestion that railway companies filed under things we'll never actually do. In truth, those snowed-in meals became part of railway folklore, a testament to British stubbornness and culinary adaptability. They proved that even in the coldest misery, the nation would find a way to brew tea, complain about it, and carry on. The good news? Everyone rediscovered the power of sharing. The bad news? They also rediscovered just how terrible Victorian biscuits really were. The Victorians prided themselves on being hardy, and nothing tested that hardiness like the creeping silent enemy of the cold, frostbite. While the age was defined by steam steel and swagger, its winters could strip even the most dignified traveller of toes, fingers, and illusions of invincibility. The truth was brutal and simple. When you travelled through snowbound Britain, you didn't just risk being late. You risked leaving a few body parts behind. Victorian travellers learned early that proper dress did not always equal proper insulation. Wool soaked up moisture like a sponge, boots leaked, and gloves froze into decorative hand sculptures. For those trapped in carriages or on stagecoaches, the cold crept in like an uninvited dinner guest, slow, polite, and lethal. It began innocently enough, a tingling in the toes, a stiffness in the fingers. Then came numbness, then came regret. The worst victims were those caught outdoors, coach drivers, postal guards, and railway workers. Hours exposed to cutting winds turned faces into wax and hands into marble. Eyewitnesses spoke of men whose ears turned to the hue of old plums, or whose noses froze white before cracking open into alarming shades of blue. But Victorian stoicism was a national sport. A driver might casually remark, "I believe my ears come off," as though discussing the price of oats. Medical understanding of frostbite existed, but sympathy was not its strong suit. Doctors described it as mortification of the extremities, which sounded far more dignified than "your fingers are dead." The official advice was almost aggressively unhelpful. Patients were told to rub the affected part with snow, a treatment that essentially involved sanding your frozen skin with more freezing material. Those who didn't stop in time often discovered that the cure was worse than the disease. And anesthesia? None, unless you counted screaming, fainting, or biting a handkerchief embroidered by your grandmother. Field treatments were nightmarish. If blackened tissue didn't recover, amputation was swift and unsentimental. Surgeons in small railway towns performed operations by candlelight, their breath fogging the air as they soared through flesh numbed only by shock. Instruments clinked against tin trays while assistants poured brandy into both patient and doctor. It wasn't exactly Grey's Anatomy. The wealthy had better odds, or at least better blankets. They travelled with fur-lined boots and foot warmers filled with hot water, though leaks could turn comfort into scalding disaster. First-class passengers occasionally carried chemical hand stoves, small metal tins that emitted heat via mysterious Victorian chemistry and occasionally smoke. The poor, of course, had no such luxuries. For them, prevention consisted of movement, stamping feet, clapping hands, and hoping frostbite affected someone else first. One 1879 report from Yorkshire told of a stranded train whose passengers spent 2 nights without heat. By the end, half had frostbite on fingers or toes, and one man, described as of sanguine temperament, attempted to thaw his feet over a lantern, resulting in minor burns and major irony. The doctor who attended him allegedly said, "At least you'll feel them again," proving once and for all that bedside manner was still under construction. Frostbite wasn't just a traveller's affliction, it plagued anyone who worked outside: lamplighters, policemen, postmen, and carriage drivers. Many returned home each night missing small pieces of themselves: fingertips, ears, pride. The newspapers called it the hidden cost of winter. The victims called it bloody freezing. Some took to wrapping their hands in rags soaked in grease or oil, believing it kept warmth in. It didn't, but at least they were too slippery to drop their lanterns. Treatment manuals of the time offered a mix of science and superstition. Alongside snow rubbing, patients were told to apply onion poultices, vinegar compresses, or goose fat to restore natural vitality. Brandy, predictably, was prescribed in generous doses, both as medicine and morale booster. If the frostbite was severe, amputation was carried out without unnecessary delay, which was Victorian for quickly before the patient changes their mind. Survivors often joked that they could predict weather changes by the ache in their missing parts, living barometers of the Empire's endless winters. Yet even frostbite could not dent the Victorian sense of pride. Travellers who lost fingers or toes often considered it a badge of endurance. Soldiers returning from winter campaigns were admired for their frost-nipped valour. Railwaymen missing half a hand still returned to work, insisting they were quite serviceable. In a society that worshipped resilience, suffering was just another form of respectability. There were moments of grim humour, too. A story circulated of a coach passenger who, upon waking from a long, cold ride, noticed a fellow traveller's nose had turned black. "Sir," he whispered, "your nose is gone," to which the other replied, "Good heavens, not again." Whether true or not, it summed up the attitude perfectly: tragedy told with a stiff upper lip and a joke colder than the weather itself. By century's end, improved clothing, heated compartments, and a little common sense reduced the threat. But for decades, frostbite remained an occupational hazard of travel, an uninvited souvenir from the age of progress. The Victorians conquered oceans, bridged rivers, and invented miracles of machinery, yet they never quite managed to defeat their own climate. The good news, you survived the journey. The bad news, not all of you made it. If the Industrial Revolution built the empire, it was the ordinary villagers who dug it out again every winter. Whenever the rails froze or stagecoaches disappeared under snow, salvation didn't come from London's boardrooms or railway offices. It came from farmers, miners and shopkeepers armed with shovels, rope, and the unshakable British instinct to help after complaining. In a nation famed for queues, understatement, and tea, rescuing strangers from blizzards became something of a civic performance, equal parts grumbling gallantry and lukewarm heroism. When trains stalled mid-route or coaches vanished on snow-choked roads, word spread faster than telegrams ever could. Bells rang, dogs barked, and within hours, entire villages mobilized. Men bundled in scarves and determination trudged toward the last known sighting. Women boiled kettles and packed baskets with bread, broth, and moral encouragement. Local vicars appeared to offer blessings and commentary, though rarely, it must be said, a shovel. By the time the first rescuers reached the scene, the stranded travellers looked up from their frosted carriages like shipwrecked sailors seeing land. The rescues themselves were feats of endurance bordering on comedy. Villagers hacked through drifts higher than fences, tied ropes around each other's waists, and advanced in formation like Arctic explorers who'd misplaced the Arctic. Horses were fitted with makeshift snowshoes fashioned from wicker, and sledges carried supplies to trapped trains, coal, blankets, and, most importantly, tea. Always tea. Even when it arrived tepid and full of soot, it was accepted as proof that civilization still existed. In rural counties such as Yorkshire, Derbyshire, and Kent, these missions became legendary. Newspapers from the 1850s onward are filled with breathless accounts of heroic locals saving gentlefolk of refinement from certain death. One story told of miners in Durham who tunnelled through snow to reach a mail coach buried for 2 days. Another of Scottish villagers who spent an entire night digging out a passenger train while singing hymns so no one would notice they were freezing. It was half rescue, half musical. The class system, for once, melted faster than the snow. Dukes and draymen alike depended on the same rescuers, and often found themselves hauled to safety by people who earned less in a year than their boots had cost. It led to surreal scenes, a viscount being carried piggyback by a blacksmith, a duchess sharing a flask with a farmhand, and a lawyer reduced to holding a lantern for a shepherd who actually knew what he was doing. If the weather had one virtue, it was forcing a quality through hypothermia. Villagers took great pride in their rescues. They wrote to newspapers describing their commendable enterprise and moral vigour in adversity. Some even established unofficial snow brigades, volunteer teams who kept equipment ready each winter. Their tools were primitive, shovels, pickaxes, and raw stubbornness, but their efficiency was remarkable. In places like the Scottish Highlands, where avalanches regularly cut off entire valleys, rescue became an annual ritual. Men, dogs, and the occasional child trudging into the white void to haul humanity back from the brink. Not every rescue ended with applause. Many were long, miserable affairs, days of digging, frozen fingers, and collapsing tunnels. Yet even failures were remembered with reverence. Villages erected plaques, held memorial teas, and wrote hymns to honour those who perished in service of their fellow travellers. The Victorians never wasted a good tragedy, they canonised it. Railway workers often joined these local efforts. Guards and engineers, having abandoned their immobilised engines, joined villagers in digging out the very machines that had once thundered past their fields. It was poetic justice. The Empire's proud technology reduced to helpless metal, rescued by the hands it usually ignored. When the tracks were finally cleared and the trains creaked back to life, the cheers echoed across valleys, a triumph of tea-fueled teamwork over mechanical pride. Children, of course, treated the chaos as a festival. They slid down snowbanks meant for rescue sleds, collected icicles as trophies, and heckled adults for digging too slowly. In many towns, the arrival of a stranded train became a public event. Locals brought lanterns, music and snacks, transforming misfortune into merriment. A traveller trapped for 48 hours might emerge to find themselves the accidental guest of honour at an impromptu village party. When the thaw finally came, gratitude flowed as freely as melted snow. Newspapers immortalised rescuers as heroes of the storm. Railway companies handed out medals, commendations, or, more often, polite letters of thanks that mentioned our deep appreciation and offered absolutely no payment. Yet the pride of having saved the day was reward enough. Entire villages dined out for years on the tale of the night they rescued the London Express, or pulled a mail coach from the drifts by hand and by heart. These stories became part of Britain's winter folklore, proof that when progress failed, humanity prevailed. The Victorians might have worshipped machines, but they trusted neighbours. They learned that heroism wasn't about grand speeches or royal decrees. It was about villagers in soggy mittens handing strangers lukewarm tea and saying, "Right then, let's get you home." The good news, the British spirit always came through in the end. The bad news, so did the weather. Again next week. If Victorian railways mastered one thing faster than steam, it was the art of the apology. Every blizzard, landslide, and unexpected weather event was swiftly followed by a corporate statement written in prose so polished it could almost distract passengers from their frostbite. "We regret to inform you the train is delayed by nature," was the essence of it. A masterclass in politeness, denial, and the subtle implication that customers should really take it up with God. The railway companies of the 19th century were Britain's proudest symbols of progress, but they were also its most prolific generators of excuses. When trains stalled in snowdrifts or vanished entirely between stations, the public demanded answers, preferably written, framed, and delivered with contrition. The result was an entire genre of literature, the Victorian apology letter. The company, these documents always began, deeply regrets any inconvenience caused to passengers due to unforeseen meteorological conditions. Words unforeseen and meteorological did a lot of heavy lifting. No matter how unpredictable the British winter was, railway companies insisted each storm was a shocking act of God. Snow had apparently taken them by surprise every single year since Queen Victoria's coronation. Reports described an unanticipated quantity of frozen precipitation, as though someone had spilled weather all over the timetable. Blaming nature was safe. You couldn't sue the atmosphere after all, and it allowed management to maintain their greatest illusion, that control had only briefly taken a holiday. When public anger boiled, the railways replied with mathematics. Company spokesmen flooded newspapers with tables, averages, and percentages designed to show that technically everything was fine. Out of 1,842 trains scheduled, only 6 failed to arrive, they would note triumphantly, without mentioning that most of the others arrived several days late, half-buried and minus a few passengers' extremities. This was Victorian corporate optimism at its best. Failure presented as statistical success. Behind the numbers, employees prepared their own brand of excuses. Guards, when confronted by irate passengers, resorted to the universal formula, "We are waiting on a signal, madam." The signal could mean anything: a message, a shovel, divine intervention. Engineers blamed the cold for everything from stuck brakes to spontaneous combustion. Station masters cited frozen points, delayed connections, or the ever-useful obstruction on the line, which might refer to snow, livestock, or another stalled train. These phrases were the 19th century version of technical difficulties and vague, comforting, and hopelessly uninformative. The tone of official statements was a marvel of restraint. Even as the public fumed about cancelled journeys and lost luggage, the railways responded with genteel calm. One company, after a 3-day line closure, issued the immortal line, "The directors beg to assure the public that every precaution short of omniscience was taken." Another blamed a temporary abundance of snow. A third, after a near-catastrophic accident, wrote, "The unfortunate circumstances may be traced to the regrettable enthusiasm of the driver." Translation: the man was trying too hard to be punctual. Newspapers devoured these apologies, printing them with both admiration and mockery. Cartoonists lampooned directors as well-fed gentlemen in top hats hiding behind clouds labelled Acts of God. Punch magazine once published a fake notice reading, "Trains delayed indefinitely due to the weather's refusal to cooperate with the company's schedule." The humour stung because it was true. The more the railway tried to sound dignified, the more human folly peeked through. Compensation was another masterpiece of avoidance. Unless a passenger could prove physical injury or loss of limb, and even then paperwork took months, refunds were rare. The fine print of most tickets included the all-powerful clause, "The company is not responsible for delays due to circumstances beyond its control." Beyond its control covered nearly everything, from blizzards and floods to mysteriously vanishing drivers. One passenger famously wrote, "It seems, sir, that your control extends only as far as the platform." The company replied, "Indeed, sir," and not a yard further during inclement weather. Internal memos, when they survived, revealed a more candid tone. Railway managers admitted chaos privately even as they projected confidence publicly. A surviving note from an 1870s official reads, "The press demands explanations, suggest we offer one that sounds clever." Another reads, "Passengers complain of frostbite, recommend we emphasise the splendid scenery." Public relations, it turned out, was born somewhere between a frozen track and a poker-faced letter to the Times. Still, one can almost admire the optimism. For all their euphemisms, railway companies themselves never stopped believing they could out-organise nature. They promised new snowplows, stronger engines, and improved weather preparedness every year, as if saying it aloud might make it true. And in fairness, they did improve, just not fast enough to prevent next year's avalanche of apologies. In time, this dance between weather and excuse became a kind of national ritual. Passengers expected the delays. Companies expected the complaints. Each side played their part with the weary grace of a long marriage. And when the spring thaw arrived and everything returned to normal, the final apology would always appear, signed with bureaucratic flourish, "The company thanks the public for its patience during this extraordinary season." The good news? They meant it. The bad news? Winter was only 9 months away. The Victorian Empire prided itself on efficiency, or at least the appearance of it. It could build railways across deserts, dig canals through jungles, and run an entire subcontinent with more paperwork than rainfall. The British Empire was, in theory, unstoppable, until, of course, it snowed in Derbyshire. Then the same civilization that ruled from Cairo to Calcutta found itself defeated by weather that small children were making snowmen out of, conquering half the world, losing to frostbite. It was one of the great contradictions of the age. Britain could manage colonies thousands of miles away, but couldn't manage its own winter. Newspapers bragged that British engineering had tamed the tropics, while at home trains froze, telegraphs fell silent, and Londoners skated unintentionally down their own streets. The Empire was exporting railways to India, yet back in Yorkshire, people were still digging theirs out by hand. The gap between imperial grandeur and local misery was wide enough to drive a snowplough through, assuming the snowplough hadn't already broken down. Imperial propaganda loved to portray Britain as a model of discipline and order, a nation whose citizens rose above discomfort with tea and moral superiority. The cold, however, ignored propaganda. It levelled duchesses and draymen alike, froze the orderly rail system into paralysis, and made British efficiency look more like British denial. Colonial administrators bragged of laying track in blazing heat and building outposts in malaria swamps, while their relatives at home were writing letters that began, "Trapped again, fire gone out, send socks." Still, the Victorians were masters of spin. If nature embarrassed them, they simply rebranded the disaster as proof of resilience. A frozen train wasn't a failure, it was a splendid example of British endurance. Passengers who nearly froze to death weren't victims, they were emblems of fortitude. Even the press joined in, hailing railway engineers as heroes of the frost frontier, as though Cumbria were some uncharted Arctic wilderness. It was empire by metaphor. If you can't dominate the climate, at least narrate it heroically. Meanwhile, the colonies themselves provided a convenient mirror. In India, British officers oversaw the construction of vast railway networks that defied monsoons, jungles, and geography itself. The rails gleamed, the engines steamed, and the empire patted itself on the back for spreading progress to the world. Yet if any of those same officials returned to England in January, they'd find progress frozen to the tracks. The contrast was embarrassing enough that colonial newspapers occasionally mocked the motherland. One Calcutta paper in 1879 quipped, "In England, snow falls and government halts. In India, rain falls and we build another bridge." To the imperial mind, such domestic weakness required explanation, or at least excuses. "Our climate is singularly trying," wrote one British commentator, as though the nation's weather were a divine test of character. Others took a moral angle. Enduring the cold was proof of virtue, while tropical comfort bred decadence. This allowed Victorians to transform hypothermia into a patriotic exercise. "Let India have its heat," one editorial sniffed. "We have character." And chilblains. Yet there was a curious hypocrisy in all this frostbitten pride. The same empire that extracted wealth from the warm corners of the world could not, for all its resources, heat its own people. While officials toasted the expansion of colonial railways, labourers in Manchester froze in unheated tenements. The empire's glory was built on global reach, but its citizens still lost fingers to local weather. It was globalisation with numb toes. Even Queen Victoria herself wasn't immune to irony. She presided over an empire that spanned climates from the Arctic to the equator, and yet Windsor Castle still suffered from freezing drafts. Servants reportedly placed hot bricks beneath Her Majesty's feet during winter audiences, ensuring the Empress of India didn't become the popsicle of England. Court gossip had it that foreign diplomats found British royal receptions impressively cold, in both manner and temperature. Abroad, British officials liked to boast that the empire ran on time. At home, trains didn't run at all. India's railways transported armies, goods, and imperial pride through scorching landscapes, while in Scotland, passengers were trapped in snowdrifts composing bitter poetry. Colonial governors sent telegrams praising efficiency to London, which in heavy frost couldn't reply because the telegraph lines were down. The empire's communication network could cross oceans but not survive a snowflake. Still, the Victorians turned even this absurdity into narrative gold. Writers like Rudyard Kipling celebrated the stoic British spirit, the ability to suffer beautifully and call it moral triumph. If empire was about conquest abroad, winter was about conquering oneself. Each frost became an allegory, a reminder that the British didn't just rule the world, they also endured it. The cold became character building, which is the kind of philosophy you invent when you can't afford heating. By the late century, some wits began to notice the contradiction. Cartoonists in Punch drew Britannia in furs, proudly holding a globe while standing knee-deep in snow beside a broken train. The caption read, "The sun never sets, except here." The joke stung because it was true. The empire's reach was endless, but its grip on the thermostat was non-existent. In the end, the snow didn't humble Britain's ambition. It simply made it look more human. For all its pomp and power, the empire was still an island that could be brought to its knees by frozen rain. Perhaps that's what made its people so peculiar, able to govern millions abroad but incapable of managing a January morning at home. The good news, the British Empire conquered continents. The bad news, it couldn't conquer its own climate. Only the Victorians could look at frostbite, hypothermia, and collapsing roofs and think, you know what this needs? A brochure. Somewhere between masochism and marketing genius, the 19th century middle class transformed winter, that season of pure, uncut suffering, into a fashionable pastime. Thus was born the age of winter tourism, a time when snow wasn't merely endured but enjoyed, preferably while spending far too much money on outerwear that didn't work. If you can't beat the blizzard, sell tickets to it. For most of history, winter was something to hide from. You stayed indoors, burned whatever wasn't nailed down, and prayed your roof held. But by the late Victorian era, Britain's booming middle class had grown restless. They had disposable income, free weekends, and an alarming desire to prove they were as hardy as their ancestors without actually doing manual labour. Snow became an aesthetic, a crisp, picturesque inconvenience that could be enjoyed in controlled doses. The logic was simple. If suffering was inevitable, one might as well do it fashionably and with cake. Enter the winter excursion. Railway companies, never ones to miss a profit opportunity, began offering special tickets to snowbound destinations. Posters advertised frosty fun at the seaside or grand excursion to the frozen north. Never mind that the seaside in January resembled an apocalyptic wasteland. The Victorians came armed with optimism and picnic baskets. Families would ride hours to reach somewhere even colder than where they started, just for the novelty of walking on frozen sand. The Alps became the crown jewel of this frosty fad. British travellers who once toured Italy for art and sunshine now went to Switzerland to freeze for pleasure. Resorts like St. Moritz and Davos marketed themselves as health retreats, where fresh alpine air could cure ailments ranging from melancholy to bad posture. Doctors endorsed it. Travel writers romanticised it. The reality, people coughed less, shivered more, and paid handsomely for the privilege. Wintering abroad became the respectable way to nearly die of exposure in another language. At home, snow became entertainment. Town councils sponsored frost fairs whenever rivers froze, a revival of an old London tradition, complete with vendors, musicians, and alarming levels of structural risk. Stalls sprouted on the Thames like mushrooms of poor judgment, selling everything from roasted chestnuts to engraved souvenirs reading, "I survived the ice of 8." Beneath their feet the river groaned ominously, an ambient reminder that gravity still existed. But Victorians were sentimental about their suffering. They sipped gin toddies, declared the experience most invigorating, and prayed the ice held until after pudding. The upper class, never content to suffer without exclusivity, invented winter sports. Skating, sledding, curling, all imported from colder nations and repackaged as refined leisure. Ladies glided across ice ponds in full skirts, gentlemen built snowmen with military precision, and newspapers declared skating the most wholesome form of flirtation. Gloves brushed, cheeks flushed, and occasionally someone fell into a frozen lake. It was romance with a side of pneumonia. Hotels quickly adapted to the trend. Inns once famous for rescuing stranded travellers now rebranded as winter retreats. Fires blazed, soup simmered, and the guests congratulated themselves for roughing it while surrounded by servants. Brochures promised the purest air and briskest snow. The same weather that used to strand mail coaches was now bracing. Even frostbite got a makeover. A touch of alpine vigour, one pamphlet called it, which is a poetic way of saying my toes have turned white. Artists and photographers joined the snow parade. Painters captured frost-tipped villages glowing with nostalgia. Photographers hauled their cumbersome cameras onto icy hillsides to immortalise families pretending to enjoy themselves. Winter was no longer a curse, it was a mood. Illustrated magazines featured rosy-cheeked skaters and cosy firesides, conveniently skipping the part where everyone's boots were soaked and the coal was running low. There was also an element of moral superiority to all this chilly enthusiasm. To enjoy the cold became a mark of refinement. Only the weak dislike winter, wrote one social commentator, presumably from under 6 blankets. The middle class, eager to prove their vigour, boasted of early morning walks in the frost, claiming it had built character, and ignoring that it also built frostbite. Endurance was fashionable again, just with better luggage. Of course, not everyone bought into the hype. The working poor, still hauling coal through blizzards, found it baffling that anyone would pay for discomfort. One miner allegedly remarked, "If they want frost, they can have my shift." Newspapers occasionally poked fun at the absurdity. Genteel ladies fainting in sleighs, dandies stuck in snowbanks, tourists paying extra for authentic cold. But for the wealthy and aspiring, winter had become a lifestyle, curated hardship available by train. By the dawn of the 20th century, winter tourism was an institution. Railways ran around snow specials, hotels offered frost packages, and Britain, the nation that once cursed every flake of snow, now congratulated itself for enjoying them. The Victorians had done the impossible, turned misery into a market. The good news? Winter was now entertainment. The bad news? So was hypothermia. If the Victorians had a national hobby beyond empire and overconfidence, it was freezing to death for glory. The 19th century produced an entire generation obsessed with the Arctic, those pale wastelands of ice mystery and conveniently British heroism. They idolised explorers like Sir John Franklin, who famously vanished in pursuit of the Northwest Passage, and later Captain Scott, who reached the South Pole just in time to die spectacularly. To the Victorians, these men weren't cautionary tales, they were icons. The cold wasn't the enemy, it was character development. You wanted adventure? Congratulations, it came to you. This obsession began, as most Victorian fascinations did, with nationalism dressed as curiosity. The Arctic was the final blank space on Britain's map, a tantalising gap in the Empire's bragging rights. Every expedition north was part science, part theatre, proof that British courage could out-freeze anyone else's. Newspapers printed breathless dispatches, society ladies donated mittens to explorers, and Parliament funded voyages that might as well have been titled Extreme Tourism, the Empire Edition. When Franklin's expedition disappeared in 1845, it only fueled the frenzy. Dozens of rescue missions followed, each more dramatic than the last. The press turned the Arctic into serialised entertainment. Latest news from the ice. Traces of heroic suffering found. It was part tragedy, part national soap opera. And yet, the Victorians couldn't get enough. Franklin became a martyr of frost, his name synonymous with courage, or more accurately, with poor planning. To die of starvation wrapped in the Union Jack was the ultimate brand statement. At home, the public devoured every detail. Engravings of ice-locked ships hung in drawing rooms. Songs like The Sailor's Farewell brought tears to respectable cheeks. Arctic maps sold out in London bookshops, even though most readers couldn't point north without assistance. Boys played Polar Expedition in their back gardens, wrapping themselves in blankets and pretending to eat imaginary seal meat. The Arctic had become Britain's coldest fantasy, distant, dangerous, and conveniently patriotic. The irony, of course, was that while Britons worshipped their explorers for enduring endless snow, the same weather was making their own trains disappear. The average London commuter had more in common with Franklin than they cared to admit. Both were trapped, underprepared, and praying for rescue. But the Victorians loved a metaphor, and the Arctic offered one too grand to resist, the idea that civilization could march into the wilderness and come out ennobled. Never mind that most came out frostbitten. Arctic fever seeped into every corner of culture. Painters like William Bradford and Frederick Church depicted shimmering icebergs bathed in golden light, nature as cathedral, frozen but divine. Poets wrote sonnets to the noble frost, and novelists turned survival into high art. Even fashion caught the chill. Furs became symbols of both wealth and endurance, as if a bit of dowered ermine could make one an honorary explorer. Londoners strutted down Bond Street in sealskin coats, blissfully unaware that their hero Franklin had likely resorted to eating his. Science too caught Arctic mania. The Royal Society sent instruments north to measure magnetism, air pressure, and human stubbornness. Specimens of ice were brought back and exhibited like gemstones. Audiences at public lectures gasped at tales of frozen landscapes and flickering auroras. It was exotic, dangerous, and, most importantly, British. Even the failures were celebrated. An expedition that returned half dead was still hailed as proof of unflinching perseverance. It wasn't about success. It was about spectacle. By the late 19th century, the Arctic had become a moral mirror. To endure cold was to prove virtue. Articles in the Illustrated London News solemnly compared frozen explorers to saints. "They perished nobly," wrote one editor, "and in their frost lies the warmth of British honour." Meanwhile, domestic frostbite victims, coachmen, chimney sweeps, and railway guards received little more than a shrug. Heroism, it seemed, required a ship and a headline. The national romanticism reached absurd levels. When the Arctic returned Franklin's ships years later, their decks eerily preserved, the public turned the wrecks into pilgrimage sites. Souvenirs were carved from timbers, poems written in his memory, and schoolchildren taught that death by ice was simply another form of patriotism. The Victorians had turned catastrophe into a parable, man versus nature, with man tragically losing but earning a monument for effort. And yet, beneath the myth, something real glimmered. The Arctic represented what Victorians secretly loved most, the test of endurance. It was the same stubbornness that kept trains running, letters posted, and tea brewed in impossible conditions. The same grit that dug railways through storms and refused to admit defeat to the weather. For all their pomposity, the Victorians understood something profound. Survival wasn't about comfort. It was about persistence, preferably narrated in heroic verse. By the time Scott met his frozen fate in Antarctica at the dawn of the 20th century, the torch of Arctic romance had dimmed, but only slightly. Britain mourned him with poetry, monuments, and a sigh of collective pride disguised as grief. Once again, the nation had proven its favourite truth, that when confronted with the unendurable, it would endure anyway, politely, with a cup of tea and an apology for dying late. The good news, the Victorians got their polar adventure. The bad news, so did everyone stuck on a train that winter. Victorian Britain was not a nation that suffered silently. It suffered eloquently. When snow buried trains and froze stagecoaches, pens soon followed shovels. Passengers and witnesses, unable to escape, did the next best thing. They wrote about it. Diaries, letters, and even poems poured forth, transforming frozen misery into moral reflection and occasionally comedy. Romanticism, after all, is the art of making frostbite sound poetic. The Victorians adored journaling, and being trapped in a snowstorm was the perfect excuse to produce heartfelt prose. "My ink has turned to treacle," one diarist complained in 1879, "but I persist, for civilization must be recorded, even as it shivers." Stranded travellers described their plight with melodrama worthy of serialised fiction. "We are encased in snow," wrote another. "Our carriage a tomb of civility. Conversation dwindles. Biscuits dwindle faster." If Instagram captions had existed, they would have read, "still trapped, send tea." The letters home were equally vivid. Husbands assured wives of their frozen constancy. Mothers told children to pray for my toes. One schoolteacher, snowbound near Leeds, began her letter primly enough. "We are in good spirits," and ended 6 pages later in existential despair. "If we do not reach York by Sunday, I shall convert to paganism and offer sacrifices to Thor the sky." The Victorians may have lacked central heating, but they never lacked drama. Poets, naturally, saw opportunity in the frost. Newspapers published verses by anonymous passengers, written on stiffened paper and delivered long after the thaw. Titles included "Ode to a Frozen Carriage," "To the Train That Would Not Move," and "Lines Composed While My Ink Froze." The tone varied from tragic to absurd. One poem, signed simply "A Lady of Compromised Circulation," lamented, "The wheels are still, the tea is cold, my feet are blue, my spirits bold. I write to prove I yet exist, a moving thought, though none have missed." The Victorians believed writing through hardship made one both noble and quotable. Even minor discomforts inspired paragraphs of reflection. Diaries spoke of the sublimity of suffering, though most entries suggest the only thing sublime was the language. There's something uniquely Victorian about describing numb fingers in iambic pentameter. Railway passengers weren't the only chroniclers. Villagers who took part in rescues also wrote letters, some factual, some shamelessly embellished. "I aided in liberating the London Express," one man wrote to the Times, conveniently omitting that his contribution was holding a lantern. Another proudly claimed he'd led passengers to safety across perilous drifts, which contemporary accounts later clarified as walked them to the nearest pub. Heroism, much like snow, tended to accumulate as it drifted. Some correspondents took an almost scientific interest in their suffering. An amateur natural philosopher trapped on a frozen train near Carlisle recorded hourly temperature readings until his thermometer shattered. He concluded that the cold exceeds both the endurance of glass and man. Others turned anthropological, noting how class distinctions melted along with their resolve. "First class and third now share blankets," one diarist wrote. "I suspect socialism is but a prolonged snowstorm." Perhaps the most fascinating of these writings are those by women whose perspectives turn domestic discomfort into literary art. A governor stranded on a coach in Devon described the ordeal as a most instructive test of patience, manners, and the flammability of wool. Another wrote in her diary that the silence of the snow reminded one of a sermon, lengthy, solemn, and inescapable. These women infused the bleakness with wit, turning endurance into elegance. Of course, not every account was noble. Some letters were pure complaint. "The tea was vile," wrote a solicitor from Manchester, "the company worse." Another fumed that even in extremity one expects punctuality. The British stiff upper lip occasionally slipped into a chattering grimace. One particularly cross correspondent signed his letter, "Yours in frost and fury." As the 19th century wore on, these personal testimonies became part of public memory. Newspapers printed excerpts turning stranded passengers into accidental celebrities. Collections of letters from the Great Blizzard appeared in pamphlet form, half reportage, half performance. They weren't just accounts of survival, they were performances of stoicism, little reminders that even when immobilised by weather, the British could still generate paperwork. Poets and painters mined these writings for inspiration. The snowstorm ceased to be a nuisance, it became a muse. Painters depicted carriages trapped in silver light, while poets described ice upon the rails as upon the heart. The Victorians found beauty in their inconvenience. If nature intended to humble them, they'd at least get a sonnet out of it. What makes these writings remarkable isn't their accuracy, but their humanity. Beneath the flourishes and exaggerations lie real voices, people trying to make sense of discomfort through words. The act of writing gave them control over chaos. It was as if by naming the cold, they could contain it. And when the thaw came, their ink-stained fingers had preserved something far greater than complaint. They'd captured the spirit of endurance that defined their age. The good news, they survived to write about it. The bad news, the pen froze halfway through. For most of the 19th century, riding a Victorian train in winter felt less like modern travel and more like volunteering for cryogenic storage. Cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was structural. Iron, glass, and open gaps turned carriages into rolling refrigerators. The passengers? Meat in transit. But eventually progress arrived in a puff of steam and the faint smell of burning coal. The Victorians had invented carriage heating, or at least something that occasionally resembled it. Progress smells like coal and relief. In the early decades of rail travel, warmth was a fantasy. The first carriages were wooden boxes with minimal insulation and no heating of any kind. The assumption was that passengers could bring their own comfort, blankets, hot bricks, or simply their faith in the power of complaining. Some resourceful travellers even carried portable foot warmers, metal tins filled with embers or boiling water slipped under rugs. These were marketed as a triumph of domestic ingenuity and worked brilliantly until they leaked, boiled over, or set one's trousers on fire. By mid-century, railways began to experiment with official heating systems, partly from compassion, but mostly because newspapers kept publishing editorials titled "Frozen Alive on the Great Western." The earliest attempts were delightfully haphazard. Some trains placed small stoves in guards' vans, with the hope that heat would drift politely down the train. It didn't. Others installed foot warmers in first-class compartments only, leaving everyone else to freeze democratically. The warmth of privilege, one journalist called it. The real breakthrough came with the hot water bottle revolution, not the bed kind but the industrial variety. Attendants filled cast-iron canisters with boiling water before departure and distributed them beneath passengers' feet. For about an hour, it was bliss. After that, the bottles cooled into elegant lumps of disappointment. Worse, on long journeys, they had to be refilled mid-route, a process involving hurried servants, splashing water, and occasional third-degree burns. By the 1860s, engineers were ready for something more permanent and more dangerous. Enter the carriage stove. These were small coal-fired furnaces installed at one end of a compartment, vented through narrow chimneys that were optimistic at best. The principle was simple: burn coal, radiate warmth, and pray the passengers didn't suffocate. Safety standards were, shall we say, flexible. Sparks escaped, smoke lingered, and more than one Victorian emerged from a journey looking like they'd been barbecued in formal wear. Still, for the first time, trains were warm, and that counted for something. Carriage heating became a point of pride among rival railways. The Great Western Railway boasted of its ingenious heating pipes, while the London and North Westerner bragged about its patent system of distributed warmth. In truth, both systems were glorified stovepipes running beneath the floor, powered by the engine's own steam. It worked, but unevenly. Passengers nearest the boiler roasted, while those at the far end developed frostbite. It was less a comfort system and more a climate experiment in motion. Stagecoaches, ever jealous of their railway cousins, tried to keep up. Some fitted small stoves beneath seats, essentially glowing buckets of coal bolted to wood. Drivers reassured passengers that the heat seldom ignites the upholstery. Others revived the time-honoured hot brick tradition, heating them in tavern fireplaces before departure. The downside, the bricks cooled faster than a Victorian romance novel once the chaperone arrived. Public reaction to these heating innovations was a mixture of gratitude and mild terror. Letters to newspapers praised the new warmth but begged for ventilation. "We no longer perish from cold," wrote one passenger in 1875, "though we now risk perishing from suffocation." Another enthusiast declared the heated train a triumph of civilization, before adding that "the stokers' singing coals did somewhat blacken my cravat." Early comfort, it seemed, came with a side of soot, but there was symbolism in the warmth. Heated trains represented progress, not just mechanical but moral. The Victorians loved the idea that technology could civilize nature. Where once the cold had conquered man, now man conquered the cold with steam steel and slightly toxic fumes. Advertisements framed it as a triumph of modernity, travel in warmth and dignity. The age of freezing is at an end. It wasn't, but optimism sold tickets. As designs improved, heating spread to all classes. By the 1880s, steam heating systems became standardized, piping warmth evenly throughout entire trains. Engineers even introduced thermostatic controls, though their accuracy hovered somewhere between too hot for humanity and Antarctic dawn. For the first time, long-distance travel in winter didn't require survival instincts, or at least not as many of them. Carriages weren't the only beneficiaries. Waiting rooms, once notorious for resembling crypts, gained fireplaces and radiators. Railway hotels added central heating, and warm travel became a mark of modern sophistication. The public had discovered that comfort could be mechanised, that warmth could be mass-produced. Progress had a temperature now, and it was blissfully above freezing. Still, nostalgia persisted. Older generations grumbled that the new heated trains were too soft, that a bit of cold built character. But most Victorians, given the choice between character and comfort, happily chose the latter, especially if it came with a cup of tea and the faint hum of a coal stove. The good news, the era of freezing railways was finally thawing. The bad news took only 50 years, several small fires, and a nationwide shortage of eyebrows to get there. By the time the 20th century dawned, Britain had learned a hard, chilly truth. Progress may have been forged in iron and steam, but it was tempered in ice. Every snowdrift, every frost-bitten passenger, and every derailed timetable left behind something more enduring than complaint: innovation. The Victorians froze so we could arrive fashionably late in comfort. The great snow ordeals of the 19th century didn't just test human patience, they reshaped the entire infrastructure of travel. Rail companies, initially content to shrug and blame unforeseen meteorological disturbances, were forced to confront the obvious. Britain's climate was not a surprise event. By the late 1800s, after decades of frostbitten chaos and public outrage, the railways finally adapted. The result was a quieter revolution, one measured not in miles conquered, but in degrees of warmth. The first improvement was engineering discipline. Track beds were raised and embankments reinforced so snowdrifts couldn't swallow them whole. Drainage systems were upgraded to prevent the endless freeze-thaw cycle that buckled rails and spirits alike. Points and switches, those pesky metal joints that froze solid at the first hint of weather, were redesigned and eventually electrically heated. In short, the Victorians learned to plan for what they had once called acts of God. The lesson: if God sends snow, build better shovels. Then came safety. The snowbound disasters had shown just how fragile progress could be when mixed with weather and optimism. Rescue protocols were formalised. Every major railway developed emergency procedures, with stocked depots along remote lines. Guards carried signalling equipment, lamps, and, after public outcry, blankets. The image of passengers trapped for days without heat or help became unacceptable. Bureaucracy, in its plodding way, learned empathy. Communication also advanced, spurred by the failures of frozen telegraph lines. By the 1890s, redundant cabling and improved insulation meant that winter could no longer mute the nation. The great blizzards of the Victorian period inadvertently accelerated Britain's transition into the wired age. What had once been a luxury for businessmen became a lifeline for everyone. And then, of course, there was comfort. Steam heating systems became standard across all classes, no longer reserved for the wealthy. Waiting rooms grew warmer, carriages cosier, and timetables less traumatic. Railway hotels installed radiators, and even rural stations adopted fireplaces, so passengers could thaw something besides their tempers. It wasn't just technological evolution, it was social evolution. Warmth became a right, not a privilege. Yet the most enduring legacy of all may have been attitude. The Victorians didn't just survive their winters, they mythologized them. They turned endurance into identity, misery into moral fibre. Out of every frost came a new layer of British stoicism, the national art of suffering politely. To wait in a coal train and declare it bracing was not delusion, it was patriotism. The snow didn't defeat them, it refined them. After all, what is Britain without the ability to complain warmly about discomfort? That stoicism carried into the modern age. The phrase "leaves on the line" may inspire groans today, but its ancestry lies in Victorian patience. Those long nights in frozen carriages where passengers consoled one another with tea and fatalism. It could be worse, they'd say, meaning, and it usually is. That blend of endurance and humour became a national inheritance, passed down through every delay notice and politely worded apology from British Rail. Ironically, it was the Victorian obsession with controlling nature that forced them to respect it. They built machines to conquer distance, but winter reminded them that distance wasn't the enemy, arrogance was. Each snowbound train was a humbling reminder that progress could pause at the first snowflake. That humility shaped later generations of engineers who approached their inventions with both ambition and caution. In a way, every modern heated carriage, every safety regulation, and every emergency hotline owes its existence to one Victorian passenger writing, "Dear Sir, I am cold and furious." By the early 1900s, railway travel in winter had transformed from ordeal to routine. Accidents decreased, delays shortened, and passengers began to view winter journeys not as trials but as minor inconveniences. The world had warmed, both literally and metaphorically. What once demanded heroism now required only patience, and perhaps an extra scarf. The Empire, too, learned from the frost. The same logistics and discipline developed to fight snow at home were exported abroad, shaping railway systems in India, Canada, and Africa. Victorian railways became global blueprints for endurance and adaptability. Somewhere between London and Lahore, the lessons of British winter found new meaning. Progress wasn't about speed, it was about resilience. Of course, the romance of suffering never truly vanished. Even in modern times, a hint of snow can paralyse the nation and summon a peculiar nostalgia. Somewhere in the collective memory, a voice still says, "Ah, but you should have seen the winter of '79. That's the final Victorian legacy. The belief that every inconvenience is a story worth telling, preferably with humour, exaggeration and a cup of tea. The good news, the Victorians froze, fumed and innovated so we could glide through winter in heated carriages, reading about their misery on our phones. The bad news, if they could see us now complaining because the Wi-Fi dropped for 3 minutes, they'd probably ask for their frostbite back."